Well, good afternoon, and I'd like to welcome everybody to the meeting of the Summer Government Accountability Committee. This is our second meeting, and today, hopefully, we're going to move the game a little bit forward because we have a relatively short period of time in order to come back to the General Assembly by the first of the year with some recommendations to go forward. We have an agenda that is quite full today. All the committee, with the exception of one member, is present. And so let's start with talking about the intentions of Act 146. And one thing before we start, though, I would ask the members to bear in mind that the goal of what we intend to do during this summer session is to come up with a series of recommendations for the committees of jurisdiction to begin working on as the legislative session goes on. We have a relatively short period of time to do this. We'll have this and likely one more meeting before those recommendations are due. And it's time to begin thinking based on what we did in the last session, what you've had a chance to think about, and what we'll do today as to what some of those recommendations might be. As you hear the testimony today, I would ask you to think a little bit about what recommendations you might have. And these can be broad and general. They don't need to go into infinitesimal detail, but the major recommendations and kinds of things that you think should be in our recommendations going forward. And at the end of the meeting today, somewhere in the 3 o'clock range, we're going to go around and we're going to ask you what your thoughts are. So I give you a slight warning ahead of time. Now, that said, let's go on to the intentions of Act 146. And we're asking Drusilla Russell, organizational change consultant, to talk to us a little bit about that. So Drusilla, you've got the floor.
Thank you, Senator. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you. It's been a while. My name is Drew Ressley. I am an organizational change consultant, but you all might remember me or know me from my time at the Agency of Human Services, where I worked for 10 years as the Director of Performance Improvement. Worked closely with former Chief Performance Officer Sue Zeller and current Chief Performance Officer Justin Kenny. So spent a lot of time with the Government Accountability Committee over the years, specifically on Act 186, which comes a little bit later in the sort of arc of this conversation between the legislature and the executive branch, at least in sort of my contemporary time. But I can start with sort of high level history, reflection, and framing around the intentions of Act 146, as you asked for, and sort of bring us up a little bit to date. So I'm going to share at a high level, knowing that I don't have that much time on your agenda today. Please do record questions because I'm happy to dig into any of these layers at a different time. And I'm going to try to lay out the biggest picture I can without spending all my time talking, so that you can ask questions and we can dig in a little bit to the nuance. I'm glad I joined with time to hear your goals for the summer session and creating recommendations. I hope that these comments will be helpful to that end. So I think, Representative Brumstead sent me like a sort of short list of the relevant statutes, basically back since 2010, that kind of help determine the Government Accountability Committee's role in the legislature and in relation to the executive branch. And those were helpful for me to refer back to. And out of them, I sort of distilled what really feel like to be 3 major goals that each of these pieces of legislation over time, all the way up to Act 166 in 2020, which was an attempt at revising Act 186, which was first framed in 2014. I think these are the 3 goals that all of these pieces of legislation have been attempting to accomplish. I believe the first is around efficiency in executive branch programs, services, and administration. So basically that there's more to show for the money that we spend as a state, doing more with less or doing the same with less. Basically the idea that there's waste and duplication across government and we should be reducing it as a as one exercise of our responsibility for governing taxpayer dollars and for executing effective programming. And that we should be clearer and clearer about how we're monitoring the performance of our programs over time. So I think that first goal, efficiency, especially related to budget and spending across executive branch programs, services, and administration. Some of you may be familiar with the term Challenges for Change, which was an initiative that started with that piece of legislation and basically incentivized government agencies and departments to take on performance improvement programs that were really about how to do more with less, basically. A little bit of a shorthand, but I think that's kind of useful in getting to the point here. The second goal is a unified agenda across state government. And this is a goal that I think comes up again and again and again over time and is certainly evident in all of these pieces of legislation, most notably Act 186, sometimes referred to as the Outcomes Bill. This is an idea, this unified agenda across state government is the idea that it's possible to guide statewide policymaking, specific program changes, and up or down investments that are all informed by current trends. So sort of measurable trends that we can experience and observe in the communities that you represent and across the state as a whole, and that the executive and legislative branch can make sense of together. So not that one has necessarily more information about than the other, but that it's data that the legislative and executive branch can use to come to a shared understanding of how Vermonters are doing. And that resonates too with community-based organizations and community members who are either doing work potentially in alignment or to change those trends, or just who are experiencing those trends themselves. So that's that second goal, I think, a unified agenda across state government. And then I perceive the third goal that all of these pieces of legislation are oriented to helping create is an informed, adaptive, and strategic legislative process. And this is where the Government Accountability Committee really comes in. So that it's possible to have some sort of committee like the one you all are representing today that can support the use of data and information to reinforce a unified agenda, to learn from agencies and departments about what activities are transpiring in alignment with that agenda and contribution to it, to invite deeper inquiry and understanding into the nuance of what's going on behind the data, what it takes to be effective, what is needed now, and what opportunities there are to shift our approach. I think implied within all of that is like my personal philosophy that it's possible for the legislative and executive branch to be very collaborative, but it's true that the Government Accountability Committee is also a place where state agencies and departments' approach could be challenged. I think it's fair to say that the Government Accountability Committee is interested in making sure that the delivery of programs and services, the use of taxpayer dollars is accountable to those Vermonters, and that there may be instances where programs are not doing what we intend them to do or are doing harm, and that needs to be evaluated and unpacked. And so the Government Accountability Committee in these statutes has positioned itself as a place that can use data and information and inquiry to surface that sort of information that can help guide decision making. So that third goal is like an informed, adaptive, and strategic leadership process. So I think those three goals are kind of evergreen in some way. Like I'm sure you've all experienced in your roles that these desires come up in the context of specific committee work, a sense of wanting to be aligned with a bigger whole, a sense of wanting to understand how far the money is going towards the work that you all want to see happening. And also this sense that like, couldn't we be more strategic as a body who's making policy? In the same way that I know that that we all know and understand that there's probably some duplication of some type of service happening across the executive branch, given histories of and structures of kind of siloed investments, but very interconnected roots and interconnected experiences across Vermont. There's also a sense of duplication of effort, sometimes even within the legislative process, like surfacing in the introduction of bills, for example, a sense that we might have 3 or 4 or 6 very similar bills attempting to do something similar? And couldn't we just find a way to be a little bit more strategic? I think all of those desires are kind of nestled behind these three goals that we've laid out here. I spent a lot of time in my career trying to figure out ways that Act 186, so the statute that lays out whole population desired outcomes for Vermonters, and whole population indicators, so measures of how all Vermonters are doing in relation to those goals, could be meaningfully used by the executive branch, community-based organizations, many of whom have grants with the state, and so are also stewarding state and federal dollars, and the legislative branch, especially policy committees who are wrestling with questions about how are things changing and what could we be doing differently. And I think one of the struggles that we've had over time is finding how to basically host conversations where enough voices can participate in the teasing apart of what's actually behind the data, that there's a sense of confidence that it's actually telling something that we want to know. And so I think a big question for the Government Accountability Committee is what it might look like to be in service of conversations that invite more voices in than just the executive branch, sort of experts in state agencies and departments, who of course are essential, but who don't necessarily help you connect the dots between population level indicators, the experiences of your constituents, and what you're learning about as being best practice in policy for the issues you care about. The auditor's office produced a report last year, sort of detailing what it perceived as some maybe failings or missing links in Act 186 as a framing document that could be used for state government and the legislative branch. And I think it's important for you all in the Government Accountability Committee to sort of understand the nuance and the difference between a desire to improve government performance and a desire to improve conditions for Vermonters living their lives. I think that the auditor's report is looking for Act 186 to be something that it never truly was, which is a way to really assess and essentially audit ongoing over time the extent to which state government funded programs are being successful, are seeing success, and are seeing change happen. Act 186 at its heart was about that second goal that I named earlier of like a unified agenda across state government that would align all of our activities toward whole population level changes. So in an ideal world, I think that Act 186 was trying to lay out, the Government Accountability Committee would be able to sit here today and ask for a presentation from someone. And I think that question around who that person is an important thing to explore in your recommendations, but that the Government Accountability Committee could ask for basically a presentation around absolutely critical whole population trends. How are Vermonters doing that help you understand, basically like where are we now relative to where we've been in the past? And that then open up an additional series of questions for you about how is our system designed to respond to those issues or this issue now? Like what government programs and services are we funding to make an impact in this particular area? So I think I guess my point, and I'm getting lost in the details, but I think my point is that there's like a higher level aim than government performance that Act 186 was seeking to create. And that was really like a way for all legislators and executive branch administrators and community-based organizations to say, this is what we want to experience in our communities. This is how we know we're not there yet. This data that's telling us that. And then these are the set of strategies that we believe are effective to help us get there. And then this is how we know how government is doing towards that effort. This is how community-based organizations are doing towards that effort. So I'm trying to lay out a little bit of nuance here. And I think the point is that in service to the legislative body, I think the Government Accountability Committee has a role to play in service to executive branch organization, or the executive branch has a role to play in service to the legislative body to understand how programs and services are doing towards those broader ends. And I also believe there's an opportunity for literally any community-based organization, anyone doing any work in Vermont outside the government space, to also feel aligned with that work. Yeah, and I think that where sometimes these issues get confused is when our desires are for an understanding of how money could be being spent differently, an understanding of how Vermonters are doing generally at a community, regional, and statewide level, and then differently how programs are performing. Those are all just three very different sets of questions that I think the Government Accountability Committee has sort of jurisdiction over, and I think need to be treated with some level of difference in each place. And I think that we may have gotten a little bit confused in the execution of some of these statutes over time, looking for one question to actually answer the other. So I think there's tons of opportunity for the Government Accountability Committee to recommend some internal process and practice shifts and to create some clarity about the different ways that you can ask questions that can guide you towards each of these three goals of efficiency, unified agenda, and an informed, adaptive, and strategic legislative process. I hope that this was effective. I see some other people joining, and so I'm feeling like my time is up, but I'm more than welcome to come in and talk again about any of this in more detail, or to help suggest or recommend some specific shifts to language that might be useful in reinforcing the direction you think you want to move.
Members of the committee, any questions or at this point?
Yes, just a comment and a question. So the comment is, I would include effectiveness with efficiency, because you can be efficient just by not filling positions. For example, you can have a very low budget, but if you're not being effective, efficiency doesn't count to me. And then the question is, I'm really curious. I'm new. This is my first year. I would really like to hear, and maybe this could be another time, about your experiences in the department and what specific recommendations you would have for actions and for making change. That would be very helpful for me, at least.
Mm-hmm. Thank
Further
you.
questions or comments?
Well,
Representative Hunter.
I mean, I do have a question, but I don't know if Drew wants to answer any of those, that question.
I'll just say quickly that I would be happy to come back and talk about my experience in the executive branch in relation to these specific, the fulfilling of these specific statutes. And I think there are many other people who are still employees of the Agency of Human Services or other places in the executive branch that could also be really helpful to hear from. And I could make some recommendations about that too.
Thanks.
Thank you. It's always really great to hear you think aloud about these issues, because I know you've considered them for so long, about them so deeply. So thank you very, very much. That the line, so there's sort of, I think we've made some inroads through various administrations around sort of cutting costs in governments. And so I feel very focused on this question of, are the interventions we're doing actually being successful the way we imagined them? And I think often when we wade into that question, like, is this program actually doing what the program was supposed to do? We often get deep into the weeds in a way that the administration, for good reason, can resent. Or we're just sort of get a little, ahead of our skis because we don't understand like all the context of it. And it's a really important question to answer. Like, we had this grand idea, we passed this legislation. Is it actually creating the thing? But the bigger question for me is always, we had this brilliant idea. And the reason we had this brilliant idea is because we all showed up in this building because we want Vermonters to be better off. We all have a very different vision, of course, of what that actually means or what that looks like, but it's why most of us run for office. And so this question of, are people better off as a result of our intervention or as the result of all of our interventions is a question that it feels like we never come even close to asking, let alone answering. And I'm curious, maybe just sort of as a follow-up to Wendy's question, like, do you have an idea of one or two things we could do within this legislative process that you've seen fairly closely over the years? Whether on the Government Accountability Committee or in just like regular policy committees to make a difference in that, in understanding the answers to that question, or even to ask that question regularly.
Thank you for that question. Yes, I think that one piece of context I'll share, or like foundation, is that when we ask questions like, is anybody better off? Or are we making a difference? Are we being successful? We are asking about interventions. I should have said this earlier, but my background being in the Agency of Human Services, a lot of my sort of go-to examples or way of thinking about this is within the context of social services. But I think it wouldn't take much to extrapolate what I'm about to say into the realm of like environmental conservation or protection or climate sustainability. There's a distance between the specific interventions that we make and the impact that we have. There's very little we actually do in service of well-being that has a very linear cause and effect relationship. And so when we ask questions like, is anybody better off for the work that we're doing? It's a genuine investigation into like, can we stand by the work we're doing? Like, do we feel that the work we're doing is having a meaningful impact in people's lives enough that we can keep justifying use of funding in this way, enough that we can keep asking people to come to us because we believe we are truly in service of them and their well-being? Actually measuring impact, is anybody better off, is very challenging when some of the interventions we're responsible for, programs and services, for example, through the Agency of Human Services, are maybe just one or two variables in somebody's much broader life. So it's always a more nuanced question that invites complexity. And so I think it's meaningful that especially the Vermont legislature already has such a practice of not only asking for data, but asking for stories of people's real lives that can help unpack what's going on behind the data. And so I would never recommend that policy committees, for example, only ever look at data to try to get a sense for how people are doing. So I just want to give like a little kudos to say that I think currently there is a high degree of value that legislative committees place on hearing from real Vermonters about their experiences generally and in relation to certain programs. Additionally, I think that there's some structure or process that the Government Accountability Committee could be supporting policy committees to do, which is asking meaningful questions of program administrators who will take the policy that you make and go execute it, asking them, what do you think are the most meaningful ways we could measure effectiveness over time? Another way of saying that is to measure change over time, from which program administrators and the legislative committee can determine whether that change feels like an improvement or not. And how frequently would it be meaningful for us to check in on this measure together, and incorporating some of that into the actual expectations that are baked into that policy? What can we measure? When should we measure this? And then being prepared to host those conversations. Basically, what is the data telling us? I think sometimes, and it's very understandable why, we set our intentions on being able to review data over time and take a look at it. And then we just get so busy with the next phase of new legislation that we forget to check back on things. I know Representative Brumsted has spent a bunch of time thinking about this. What would it look like to have a performance note or a measure or evaluation or learning note in addition to a budgetary note or a fiscal note that accompanies bills through the legislative process, as a way of saying over time, we would throw the stone to ask ourselves, like, how well are we doing? Is anybody better off for this work that we did? And use that as an opportunity to reflect about what changes might need to be made to do a little bit better, whether that's going to be in program management or policy change.
So very quick follow-up. I'm wondering, so that word host is a great one. And so this question of what it will take for us to actually host those follow-up conversations is one that I feel quite lost on, despite the fact that I set the agenda for a committee. And so I feel like that hosting of that follow-up conversation needs some structure to it. And I'm not quite sure what that structure is that everyone, because it needs to be a structure that everyone can access, regardless of where they are in the policy conversation or the history of that bill. You might have people in the room who actually drafted the bill, and you might have people in the room that know nothing about it. And so, we only have a couple minutes left, so please, feel free to give initial thoughts, but I would love your deeper thoughts as well as sort of the structure to host that conversation in a meaningful way that might actually work in this file place work.
I love that question too. I mean, just speaking candidly, it's been so interesting as a former executive branch employee to participate with the Government Accountability Committee as a non-voting member. To me, it felt like a microcosm of what it can look like for a legislative committee and executive branch staff to participate in a conversation about learning together. And I sometimes wish that we could see more spaces where legislative branch, where senators and representatives feel like they have the spaciousness to invite conversations that involve whether it's testimony in a policy committee or a joint committee hearing or something less formal than that, where multiple people bringing expertise and experience in and outside government can come together around one issue area and really explore the nuance of the data related to the policy that was passed 3 years ago or last year, or that's up for debate this coming year. I remember the same year that Act 180, I think must have been 2014, that there was a robust housing conversation. Someone, I can't remember who, was deciding to host conversations about housing in the State House. And I believe it was legislatively facilitated. And I remember that it sort of trickled out. And I think it was just because bandwidth was lost. So your question, Representative Kornheiser, makes me think about the Joint Fiscal Office. It makes me think about the few places in the legislative system now, or Ledge Council even, where there actually are staff. There's there's resource, there's support, there's ongoing practice of building expertise in the questions that legislators are going to need to feel strategic when they make major decisions about investments. And I think we're having a very similar conversation here today about what does it mean for the legislature to feel strategic in making conversations based on government performance and Vermonters' measurable needs. And so I think one strategy that the Government Accountability Committee could explore more is what would it look like for the legislature to take on that same responsibility related to data about population indicators and government performance. What's the appropriateness of that? What are the boundaries around that? To be in conversation with the executive branch, but not in a position to sort of micromanage data collection or performance. I think that's a very alive possibility personally. But that's only one strategy that comes to mind.
Well, thank you very much for the input, the information, and you've given us a lot to think about. I would ask also that perhaps you think a little bit about the outcome of your testimony today vis-a-vis outcomes and what we're trying to do regarding crafting legislation that helps us towards those ends. And if you have any additional thoughts, to record those and send them to the committee that we can look at further and perhaps talk with you further. One of the issues that always faces us is we are looking at broad outcomes that appear in state outcomes report on the one hand, and we're looking at discrete pieces of legislation on the other. And with respect to discrete pieces of legislation, we're constantly asking ourselves, did this bill do what it is intended to do? In fact, does it really state what it's intended to do? Does it in fact do that? And can we measure it either through data or through some other method? Now, once we measure it did what it said it was going to do, did it help the overall outcome in the broad categories of outcomes that we're looking to have? And again, the mechanism for doing that is something that we also need to think about. We can have pieces of legislation that do exactly what they say they're going to do, and it makes no difference to the end result of any of these broad outcomes. And again, it's how to get that connection in a way that's really meaningful without creating a bureaucratic nightmare in the process. That's our challenge. And to the extent that you could think about that a little bit and perhaps inform us further, I think it would be very helpful. Unfortunately, our time is short today, but thank you, Drew, very much for your input. It's very helpful.
Great. I love that invitation. Thank you, Senator. And thank you, everyone. I'm happy to be here and grateful for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, one of the things in our process of setting up these meetings, we certainly reached out to the National Council of State Legislatures and others to ask us, well, why do we need to go through this exercise at all? Because somebody else has probably done this and has solved all our problems. And they have gone out and looked at a number of states and how they deal with accountability. And we've looked at some of the results that they've come back to us. And we see a couple that are particularly noteworthy that we'd like to hear more about. And we're grateful today to hear from the state of New Mexico, the New Mexico Legislative Finance Committee in particular, who are going to talk with us about some of the things that they've done. And I think we touched on it the last time in our meeting and our presentation from NCSL, and we're grateful today to have representatives from New Mexico here with us. First is Charles Sally, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes, sir.
Okay, who is the director of the New Mexico Legislative Finance Committee, and Michaela Fisher, a program evaluation manager also of the committee. And so I'd love to turn the floor over to you, and perhaps you can help us solve our problems.
Great. If I can get screen sharing, I'll go ahead and bring up a presentation that we'll run through about what we've been working on over the past 30 so years here at the Legislative Finance Committee.
Think you have it.
Great. So thank you again for having us. Again, my name's Charles Salee. I'm the new staff director. I've been deputy director for many years here of the Legislative Finance Committee. Our Legislative Finance Committee is basically our joint budget committee for the interim. It's got oversight of all the financial management and accountability for state government, as well as all political subdivisions, including school districts and higher education. It's a bicameral joint committee that's proportionate to the political makeup of each chamber, and it's staffed by nonpartisan team of fiscal analysts, economists, program evaluators, and support staff. Something that is somewhat unique to New Mexico, along with a handful of other Western states, is the committee's main statutory charge is to develop and make a budget recommendation for all of state government, higher education, and public schools to the full legislature that meets starting each January. So right now, in fact, next week, we're going to start our budget development process, and the committee will be hearing all of the agency budget requests and developing that budget recommendation. So we have a team of fiscal analysts that work to make those staff recommendations to the committee. And I'll talk a little bit about a framework that we've developed to help advise the committee in developing that budget recommendation over the past decade and a half. We also house our government accountability unit, the program evaluation unit within the budget shop. I think only Texas both makes a budget recommendation and houses a government accountability unit in the budget shop. And that's really important for us to be able to go out and do the deep dive for the things that are relevant for budget development and answering the question. We made an investment in pre-K. Did it make an impact on third grade reading scores, which was the intent of the investment to begin with? Those program evaluation really help us go out and look at that. LFC itself, the committee was originally established in 1957. We established that program evaluation unit. It was really more focused on performance auditing in around 1990. It was interesting. There was a new state auditor that came in that wanted nothing to do with that government accountability function. He ended up in federal prison a number of years later. Now we know why. But New Mexico, like many other states, started getting interested in performance-based budgeting in the mid 1990s, culminating into the Accountability in Government Act, which passed and was signed in 2000, and really started implementing a performance-based budgeting approach. I call it performance-informed budgeting. It doesn't replace the decision-making that needs to go into how much to allocate. There's a lot of good things that come with that process, and there's a lot of unanswered questions that I'll talk about as well. NCSL really was very informative for a lot of states in the early 2000s about best practices for how to use this information, how to hold public hearings, what are the results coming from it, and LFC and the state ultimately implemented a performance reporting system that we get data from our major agencies on a quarterly basis and put that together into basically a performance report card. In 2019, we continued to evolve and update our Accountability in Government Act to include requirements for agencies to not only do the strategic planning, do the performance measurement, are we getting to where we want to go, but also how are we using the resources that we have? Are we spending it on evidence-based interventions? So this required agencies that are selected by LFC and the governor's budget shop to go basically do an inventory of their programs to identify if they're spending money on evidence-based interventions, promising practices, and then build that into their budget request. LFC during this time had been here having regular performance hearings from agencies to go over the data, how well we're doing on third grade literacy, what kinds of outcomes are we seeing from our investments in Medicaid, criminal justice. But those hearings were turning out to be almost filibusters by agency. And really the straw that broke the camel's back was a lot of concern about our Child Protective Services system. We had a performance hearing for the second year in a row. The cabinet secretary came in with a 100-page PowerPoint and didn't answer any of the key performance questions that the committee had, didn't even leave enough time for the committee to really have a dialogue around that. And so they charged us with coming up with a new system for having these performance conversations. And we piloted in 2021, something that we call Legistat that I'll go into more detail. And that's trying to adapt a performance management system, which the legislature is not the manager, but a system like that of continually coming back to key performance challenges, but in a legislative setting. And we've been having those hearings now for the last couple of years. The latest development is the committee wanting to beef up our budget guidelines that really call to using performance information, using the results of program evaluation. How do we make sure that we're efficient, effective, and really putting the onus back on agencies in their budget justifications. And we developed basically a budget guide for agencies that need to fill out to take a better job at really detailing out how they're going to implement some of these things through the budget process. So our legislating for results framework, this is really an adaptation of a continuous improvement process, but it really starts with performance data and those performance report cards. How are we doing? It's almost, we've got our top largest agencies, like I said, are reporting on a quarterly basis. It's a lot of information. It's a state of the state every quarter. But what do you do with it? We really use it almost as a surveillance tool to say, where do we need to pay attention? And the scorecard, as you'll see in the next couple of slides, uses a red, yellow, and green rating system to be able to allow busy readers to quickly zero in on what they need to pay attention to. That performance information is really important. It says, pay attention to me at Child Protective Services. Things are not going in the right direction. But that performance information does not tell you why or what to do about it. then our staff need to go out and do a deeper dive. How are we spending the money? Are we spending it on the right things? Do we have implementation problems? We had our corrections program was implementing an evidence-based substance abuse treatment program that we could have just stopped there and said, well, that's great. You're implementing what should on paper work. But we went a step further to say, how well are you implementing it and what are the results? And what we found was the implementation was so poor for that evidence-based intervention that offenders that were participating in it were returning to prison at a higher rate than their peers who didn't get that intervention. So reviewing, how are we going to get better outcomes for third grade literacy, that deep dive analysis and maybe even program evaluation. Then we identify where should we invest and build that into the budget development process. We've been building out a universal pre-K program for basically a decade using performance data. As we continue to build that out, are we seeing the kinds of results that we want? We've got kids that we're following all the way into college right now, where we're finding that the gains that we originally hoped for have been sustained through third grade, through eighth grade, through high school graduation, and even college going rates. And we've built that into the budget development process over time. And like I said, with that corrections example, not stopping there, the committee continuing to dig in once the budget's been passed, are we implementing it as intended? And then at the end of the day, you're making investments for a reason. What's the impact? Are you getting those results that you originally intended coming back full circle? The tools that we're using as an office staff to help with this analysis, traditional policy analysis, cost benefit, other research, performance measurements, public hearings. Some of the products that come out of that are staff briefs, our budget volumes, fiscal impact reports, report cards, our Legistat briefs, a number of different work products that we try to get in front of the committee on a regular basis to be able to answer what are we getting for the investments that we're making as a state. I'm going to focus in on some of these for this presentation this morning. So our quarterly report cards will have a wealth of information as well as analysis. You can see the scorecard rating for Child Protective Services. One thing that we pay more attention to today than I think when we originally started is target setting. Not to be too easy, but not to be too hard to come up with those stretch metrics. Those are actually set through the legislative budget process. The governor's office will make a recommendation, LFC will make a recommendation, and the appropriations committees will decide which measures make it into the actual appropriations bill, what the targets are, and they'll also make decisions about other metrics that might not be in the bill, but the agencies are expected to report on. Ideally, this agencies would have these measures totally in alignment with a solid strategic plan. They'd have an action plan associated with how to improve these particular outcomes. They'd have timelines, they'd have responsibility assigned. You can see in the upper right-hand corner on the left side, we're tracking whether or not these agencies have that in place, and where we see faltering, usually it's because they're not doing the kind of performance management that is necessary to drive these changes. There's a lot of tension in what we are measuring between agencies will tend to want to measure things that they feel they are in direct control over. Processing paperwork is usually tops on the list. So you can get in discussions with like your environment department. Your constituents probably care more about whether they're drinking clean water and breathing clean air versus whether the environment department is processing certain permit applications in a timely way. It's not unimportant, but we try to tend to get to the things that the public will really care about. But the agencies will push back quite a bit on being responsible for ensuring clean water and clean air or safety of children, much more comfortable with reporting on things they have closer control over. So that's a tension that you'll experience if you move in the direction of trying to expand your performance measurement system. The program evaluations, when the why and what to do about it kind of questions are too big for an individual analyst to try to dig into during the interim through like a hearing brief. We'll go out and do a 3 to 5 month deep dive with a team of usually 2, maybe at a really large complex project, 4 program evaluators. And the essence of their work is, how much did you get to do what? What were the results? How do we improve? That's the essence of what the program evaluation unit is going to be working on. Less compliance driven, like performance auditing or your financial statement audits. More trying to answer the questions: what did we spend money on? What were the outcomes? How do we get better results? Tying that into the budget process more closely than what you might see in some other places. Legistat, this was really designed in consultation with people like former Governor O'Malley in Maryland, who implemented a performance stat system when he was governor as well as when he was mayor. Many other jurisdictions have done the same thing, where they're trying to manage for results. So you've got the head of an agency coming back to specific performance challenges that they want resolved, whether that's filling potholes, whether that's crime hotspots, whether that's clean drinking water around the Chesapeake Bay, those types of things. But what's key about a stat process is that leaders are coming back to the same performance challenges on a regular basis until those performance challenges have been resolved. And so we've tried to adapt this into a legislative context, knowing that the LFC and the legislature are not the executive. They're not the boss of the cabinet secretaries, but we wanted to create a space to have more of a conversation about how do we move forward on a subset of those performance measures that you see in the report cards. What are we going to do about repeat maltreatment in child protective services? What is the action plan? What will be different when we come back to this conversation 3 to 4 months from now? What will be different when we come back to our budget hearings in the fall, and then possibly even touching on it in the legislative session? So we've done this with a number of agencies so far. We started out trying to have a focused conversation about economic recovery coming out of the pandemic. So we had conversations with our Workforce Solutions Department, our Economic Development Department, and our Tourism Department, since tourism is such a large part of our employment base and our economy in the state. Tourism Secretary really owned it, took off. The performance challenges that we addressed, our tourism economy has surpassed where we're at pre-pandemic. They've been released from performance stat, and we're not coming back to them. But the other agencies we're coming back to 2 to 3 times a year. That's one of the biggest challenges we found, is finding enough time to have, with all of the things that the committee is responsible for overseeing, to have those focused conversations. And what's really important behind this amount of time is that for years I've seen agencies come in and they know that if they can get through that public hearing, they may not be held accountable or have to come back to the committee on a specific performance challenge, maybe for a year. Maybe people will forget about it after that period of time. But I've seen committee members through the years have almost stock questions that if an agency knew that they were going to come back to that, they needed to have a performance management plan and really address that. So like our former chair is a good example. He, before he started in the legislature, he was the state controller, and he was really on the performance challenge of agencies not turning in their financial statement audits on time. And so he would have a question at every single budget hearing. Where are you with finishing your financial statement audit? He also represented Santa Fe, so he was interested in, he's a company town. Where are you with filling all of your vacant positions? And those 2 stock questions that were important to him, agencies responded to it. And so some of the theory behind the Legistat is if that members continue to come back to those key questions over and over and over again, the agencies will respond because as one cabinet secretary told me, I do not want to go back before your chair without having addressed this performance challenge before I come back to ask for my budget next fall. So that's the theory behind Legistat. Some of the principles that we try to use, again, zeroing in on only a handful of maybe 3 to 4 performance challenges, so very focused. The structure of the hearing is flipped, where the agency only is allowed to speak after the analyst goes through the brief, our analyst, and then they've got about 5 minutes to bring up what they've done from the last hearing or what they plan to do between the next hearing. And then the hearing is opened up to Q&A, to have a conversation with the committee. So really committee driven, a lot of emphasis on deeper dives, a lot of discussions with the committee about trying to get to the root causes of problems using like the 5 whys. You don't have to be a content expert to just continue to ask why something is occurring to get to a deeper understanding about what's going on. An expectation that we come out of this that is action oriented. What's going to be different between this meeting and the next Legistat meeting that builds into that accountability cadence. Recognizing that because the legislature is, the board of directors overseeing this, it really requires a more collaborative approach between legislators and agency leaders. And these are not hearings that are designed for gotcha. And really at the end of the day, impact. Are we, as a result of this effort, are we seeing, things change? Are we seeing our employment levels increase because of the investments that we make in our economic development agency and seeing those kinds of differences? The budget guidelines and the 7 elements, again, all of this had been part of our budget guidelines and the development process. Now we're just packaging it and really emphasizing implementation and fidelity, implementing it right, as well as more specific measurement and evaluation for budget expansions. We had like our Office of Family Representation, which provides attorneys for families that are involved in child protective services. They want to radically change how they're representing families and the kinds of staff that they would have supporting them in that process. That's great. We're going to have you really detail out that description of the program, what research or evidence behind it, how exactly you're going to implement it, what kind of scale will this investment make? Are you going to be able to only serve 10% of the population? If you don't have good research behind it, are you going to develop research questions to be able to answer? And then how will we know this specific investment is working? What are your key performance metrics that are going to be tied to that? And staff will be evaluating that and using it to make budget recommendations for those major expansion services that we're seeing in agencies. The committee's also been just promoting a more results-focused government. We've held trainings for agencies on these best practices that we want them to be developing, and we will highlight throughout the year when we see them using these best practices. That's everything from having an evidence-based budgeting process, which the legislature has been doing. We're trying to get agencies on board, developing a basic learning agenda, encouraging rapid experimentation and risk-taking within the executive agencies, which they're very risk adverse. There's definitely low cost, low risk ways to do experimentation. We want to encourage that. Improving some of our contracting approaches, performance management, best practices is something that we're really emphasizing a lot with agencies. The legislature is probably way further along in evidence-based policymaking and budgeting. We're trying to bring the executive agencies along so that we can get better results for the people of the state of New Mexico. There's a lot of resources on our website. If you'd like, I can forward some examples to your staff so you don't have to wade through all of those. Just let me know if that's something that you'd like. Michaela, did I miss anything?
Way to go, boss. Nope, good.
Great. we'll be happy to answer questions and have a dialogue about what we've been doing and how we might be helpful to you all.
Do you have a couple of days to talk with us? Because you've written this a superb presentation, and we're very appreciative of your assistance. I know that many of us have a number of questions. Let me just start out with a few and then turn it over to the rest of the committee. I think we have until 45 minutes after the hour, if I'm reading my agenda correctly. What sort of staff is involved in executing this entire program?
So we have the fiscal analysts that are responsible for the quarterly performance reports, and their backgrounds vary widely. A lot of them could be MBAs, public administration, masters in public policy. We try to hire at the master's level. The program evaluators, strong social science background, some attorneys. My background is in social work administration. Before I got into government accountability work 20 plus years ago, I practiced social work, but really wanted to get into public policy work. So my social work administration background has served me well. So those are some of the backgrounds of staff. We've got about 40 total, including support staff when we're fully employed.
One of the things that we sometimes hear about accountability, measuring accountability for programs, particularly in areas such as economic development, we also hear it in education, is we establish a new program that adds to what we're doing in each of these areas. And some will come back and say, yes, but how do you know that this positive result would not have happened even absent the investment that you've made? We see that particularly with economic development investments, for example, that business would have expanded regardless of the investment that you put in. Or in education, you put in this huge amount of increase and the test scores are continuing to go down. So it was independent of anything that you've done. How do you deal with and do you encounter those kinds of situations? And how do you deal with it in terms of your performance reporting?
Yeah, yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. The but for question in economic development is very difficult, if you don't have a control group. So that one we really struggle with as a state as well. For education, we've done randomized control trials to help answer those questions. We've done other quasi-experimental studies with our evaluation of our pre-K system to try to control for the kids who actually got the intervention versus the kids who don't. What you often find in education in particular is you're testing out or funding a new program, but its scale is not sufficient to impact your population-based third grade reading outcomes. And so we saw that as we were building out our pre-K program, where we were seeing positive results from kids that were participating in pre-K. There just weren't that many early on. And so we'd have to isolate the recipients of the service and what their outcomes were from the larger population. That said, also we have to have very frank conversations about expectations for what kinds of outcomes these interventions will produce. Our pre-K program is not a silver bullet. It is cost beneficial. We've run all the data on that, but it's only boosting third grade literacy scores by a couple of percentage points. So it's not like it's taking us from 50th to 25th. It's an important intervention, but it's not a silver bullet for all of those things. So that's an important thing. We've been doing cutting edge cost benefit analysis where we had worked with the Pew Results First initiative for the last maybe 12 years. They provided us with all of the best research about what works. We would apply that research in a cost benefit model to our own New Mexico specific performance and cost information to produce a return on investment estimate. And we use that research to kind of estimate if you were to invest in this nurse family partnership, here's how much in a reduction of child abuse and neglect you can expect from those participants that got that intervention. And those things can range from 5 to 9% sometimes change. So those conversations are really important to have so that our expectation isn't that these social interventions are going to be like total game changers. And really that's where we try to have those conversations when we set those performance targets as well.
You've been doing this obviously for a number of years. As you think back, and I know perhaps you weren't there at the time, as to when you started down this road, what were the first few baby steps that New Mexico took to lead you to the result that you're at now?
Yeah, the good question, Mr. Chairman. For like the performance reporting system, your agencies are probably already collecting and reporting a lot of measures to the federal government that you can start with as kind of a core subset of metrics that you're not having to go out there and recreate the wheel. We've worked really hard and not gotten much traction to have NCSL start housing, basically a database of best practice performance measures. That's something we're continuing to work on with the results focused governing initiative that they've got. But looking to other states, how do you measure your environment department? How do you measure your corrections department? Trying to somebody, like you said earlier when we opened up, somebody's probably already done this, figuring out how to ease into that. The federal measures are the easiest one, and starting with where you've got a lot of federal dollars flowing in. Medicaid will have a huge suite of healthcare metrics that maybe are not the best outcome measures, but they tell you a lot about whether your kids that are enrolled are getting their well child visits, whether people's diabetes is under control, whether their asthma is under control, whether people can access services. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit from my standpoint that you could probably move on from a performance measurement system.
You had a linkage with the state auditor's office in terms of performance auditing at one point. Is there performance auditing done independently at this point, or is all the metrics validation done by the staff of your committee?
Right. The staff, when we're doing program evaluations, will do test work to make sure that those data are accurate. We'll question it through the performance reporting process, like our corrections department for like 2 years in a row was reporting the precise exact same recidivism data. And we're like, that doesn't make any sense. Each agency is required to have what's called a monitoring report, where they detail where the data is coming from, how the performance measure is actually calculated. They've got very detailed reports that they're supposed to put together for somebody to be able to go in and validate. I've tried to get subsequent auditors to go make that part of their financial statement audit procedures. I haven't had luck there yet. But my point to the auditor is you're making sure that the financial statements are accurate, but we're using performance information in the legislature and the public's expecting it. That's the whole point of all of this spending. We need to make sure that that performance reporting is just as accurate as the financial statements. So ideally, we have the financial statement auditors get in and validate those measures on a more regular basis.
Representative Brumstead.
Thank you. And thank you very much. This was incredibly informative, but also somewhat of a teaser because there are so many more questions. And so I'm going to just ask a couple of really basic questions. If a legislator comes, at the beginning of the session, and I know you have a session similar to ours, right? January to the summer, early summer.
Ours are either 30 days in an even year or 60 days in an odd year.
Oh, wow. Even shorter. Okay.
Yeah. So a lot of the budget
Unbelievable.
development work, yeah. So a lot of the budget development work occurs during the interim and in the fall after September 1st, when we get the agency budget request. So it's not as if they're putting it together from scratch in January.
Okay, so if a legislator is hearing from their constituents that, there's a problem and they write legislation, are they encouraged to, before that bill gets submitted, encouraged to work with the program evaluation unit, or are they receiving education to know how important it is that they have performance way to collect performance information in their bill?
Yes, we will be presenting those performance reports, not just to our legislative finance committee, but other interim committees like courts and corrections or health and human services. We present the program evaluations for the relevant agencies to those other committees to inform what's going on. Ideally, they'd start with that information and then figure out if there's, because like I said earlier, the performance information doesn't tell you why or what to do about it. That's where really there needs to be additional oversight hearings to understand, is there legislation even needed? Is it a resource deficiency problem? Is it a resource allocation problem? Is it an implementation problem? A bill may not fix all of that. You know, right now, our Child Protective Services, not like many other states, is not functioning at a level that we want as a state, but it's not a statutory problem and it's not a resource problem. It's literally like a leadership and an implementation. So that's very frustrating for the legislature because they poured money into the program. Structurally, how that's being spent, you know, needs improvement. But they're searching for legislative bill solutions that, in my opinion, are we can go ahead and do. It will be do no harm, but it's really an implementation problem on the part of the executive, and we have to have more focused performance conversations with that department about what their literal action plan is between now and 2-3 months from now, and stay focused on that. Because it's such a hot topic, it's very difficult. Legistat, one of the challenges we have, it's a 16-member committee, but because we're the budget committee and because we've got so much money right now, we're getting 26 to 30 members showing up wanting to participate, and trying to have a focused performance conversation with 16 people is really challenging. But when you're almost doubling that, it's even more challenging when you've got other members coming in, and maybe that's their one shot to ask a question to that cabinet secretary on that particular, not even on that topic, just on something that's important for them. So that's something the chairs have been grappling with, how to handle with our normal Q&A sessions for those Legistat hearings.
Thank you. I mean, we struggle with very similar issues around implementation and knowing how to assure implementation with legislative intent in mind.
Yes.
And so does every committee get involved in in understanding how this all works? In other words, is every committee having those focused conversations that you cited in your material?
Mr. Chair, no, they're not. That's something that would be really ideal. Force multiplier. If, you know, courts and criminal justice did that on a regular basis with the corrections department, public safety department, LHHS did that with children, youth and families, with Medicaid. That's something, you know, Legistat is still pretty new for the Legislative Finance Committee and is not spread to other committees. It has survived a transition in chairs though. So that's, you know, from a political science standpoint, a pretty good sign for this kind of approach. It's still in its infancy.
Okay, and I'll let others, I could go on and on.
Very much like, and a very clear follow-up to Representative Brumsted's question. And thank you so much for coming in. I saw you speak at an NCSL fiscal meeting maybe a year ago with a member of our joint fiscal staff, and we both got very, very excited. And this is my first follow-up. So you mentioned that you do sort of deliver the information to the policy committee that's relevant. And we have a joint fiscal committee here, but it doesn't have anywhere near the sort of time or power that your joint fiscal committee does, because our policy committees spend a lot more time meeting. So when you deliver that information to the policy committees, is it really just like you're sending documents, or do you make your staff available to really have the kind of guided conversations that you do with the joint fiscal committee?
Mr. Chair, we'll make our staff available for presentations, for additional offline conversations. You know, like right now we've been asked informally to go back through our research and other best practices for, what are some policy options as well as fiscal options for the policy committee to consider on criminal justice reform, on child protective services reform. And so, sometimes it can get a little bit territorial between the policy and the fiscal committees. But we try to break that down, because at the end of the day, you're going to need money to do the policy, likely anyways. And so we should be working as close hand in glove as possible. That same is true with the education committee, where there's historically been more of a kind of turf issues there that we've, as staff, been trying to break down.
So it sounds like this is like your next growth area is like really stepping into being of greater service to the policy committees.
Mr. Chair, in terms of like a legistat approach, yes. In terms of making information available from our program evaluation and from our performance and from a fiscal standpoint, I think we do a pretty good job of that now. But having them be a force multiplier on ongoing conversations with agencies about improving performance, that would be really useful, I think, from my perspective, for our legislature to move into.
Thank you.
Senator Harrison,
Do you have some? I do. Okay, well,
defer to
I just
Senator Renner
didn't
then.
want to, I would want to give everyone. Okay, I have two questions. So whichever one you think is more relevant or able to answer. And thank you for being here. Thanks for having a great website too, because that's a really good source of information. I'm interested to know if you use these programs for internal service agencies like HR and finance, those kind of agencies. And then if you have a way of in the performance measurements, getting direct feedback from customers through surveys or some other confidential way of getting feedback.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We don't have very many, if at any, customer service oriented measures that are out there. That is a best practice. It's not an area where our agencies have moved into. Texas was a national leader in the 90s and early 2000s on having a pretty robust system. I'm not sure where they're at today for having a lot of survey data from customers. Some agencies collect it, like your MVD. It's not filtered its way into our performance reporting. The internal service agencies, like a general services department, that's where we look to private industry for performance measure best practices, because our general services department is going to be running a rental car agency. It's going to be renting out airplanes. It's going to be doing a healthcare insurance, doing risk insurance. They're not the leaders in state government for performance measurement or performance management, but if they're really well run internal service agencies, they should have all of those industry best practice performance metrics, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Renner.
Thank you. I also am very grateful for your being here, both of you. I guess I'd like to look at the end game of this process. You mentioned, for example, the prison system having a poor method of implementation that was causing even more recidivism. Can you speak, either of you, to an example, that one or otherwise, of how legislation or process was changed after you found results like that? Because I'm extremely concerned that, people dig in. They've promised their constituents something. The advocates have pushed something. People have had a big positive push for a certain law. And you come in with data that shows, didn't work. I'm really curious how that plays and how you talk about that correction and how people graciously or don't back off.
Yeah, Mr. Chair. So there's a number of examples, but in the case of corrections, to their credit, they scrapped that program and implemented a different evidence-based program because the culture of the staff and how they were implementing it was so ingrained that they didn't think that they could go back and course correct So as I tell people, either fix it or get rid of it. And in some cases, the legislature has gotten rid of it, even in high priority areas like early childhood. We went in and said either these programs had no way of showing their impact relative to these other investments that we know are working. It took a great recession for them to pull the plug, because resource reallocation is very challenging. But that can happen. I think one of the latest example of where our performance and program evaluation data is really in the limelight is around our bail reform and pretrial detention, because we've had a spike in crime in our largest city for the past 5 or 6 years. Elected DAs and other individuals will point to the fact that we're not just locking up people waiting for trial for long periods of time anymore as what's driving that crime. But when they propose policy solutions, we actually run that through, analysis of what the impact would be, and found very controversially that it wouldn't actually do anything. But the governor had been on board. She was under a lot of pressure to run for reelection. The DA was running for attorney general. And basically, our staff came out with memos at the beginning of the session, said that these policy changes would in fact rope up a lot of other people and keep them in jail that weren't out on the streets committing new offenses. Very controversial. We are very grateful that the chair of Senate Judiciary used that information and basically said, we're not doing these policy changes. That said, I've instructed my staff that the political pressure is heating up so much. We've got to go and give alternatives that are going to be constructive at moving forward with resolving this particular issue. We can't just have this information be used as a holding up other policy ideas. We have to come forward with other options for people to consider. So yes, there's a lot of tension when it comes to actually using this information for decision making, and you'll have very deep rooted constituency groups that will feel very strongly. Another good example of that is our domestic violence offender treatment programs. They don't work. The evidence suggests that the approach that they're taking may be making the problem worse, but that particular community is not budging at all on making any changes to how they're dealing with domestic violence perpetrators.
Thank you. Representative Brumsted, I think you had a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up at the end. Michaela and I had a good conversation about sort of next steps for us. So we're a summer fall government accountability committee, and I think all of us, I can say, are pretty excited about all that you have said. But we are making broad recommendations for our government operations committees. And so most likely you will hear from the chairs of those committees as well, because I think that this information is incredibly exciting. We realize that it would probably be pretty expensive and will take some time for maybe us to get there. But some of what you talked about is the early baby steps we do have in place in our outcomes report. And so we kind of started that work 10 years ago, and we can build on that. So the information you've given us is invaluable. I really feel very strong about that. It's funny, our next speaker is someone who is collecting data on childcare, and she is, texting me saying, "Ooh, what are the metrics that they used on pre-K?" Because it's so important for us all in this world, really, to be able to look back and say, are we having the intended impact? And the examples you just gave to Senator Renner are very exciting because we don't know. We often do our best to go at what we think is causing a problem, and we don't really have anything to look at. So I thank you very, very much for being here and for all the work you're doing in New Mexico.
And I share Representative Brumsted's comments. Thank you again very, very much. And we appreciate it. And I expect that you will hear from us again.
That sounds great, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity, and we're here to help in any way we can.
Thank you.
Great.
Goodbye now.
Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
We now are going to move next to Morgan Crossman for the Executive Director of Building Bright Futures. And we're going to take those comments that we've heard about childcare and put it in the real world.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Morgan Crossman, and as the chair said, I'm the Executive Director of Building Bright Futures. I'm joined this afternoon by our Research and Data Director, Dora Levinson, and wanted her to be able to introduce herself as well.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm Dora Levinson, as Morgan shared, Research and Data Director at Building Bright Futures.
And I just want to commend the committee for the lineup and a panel of speakers that you've had in place today. Drew is such an incredible colleague in this space, and we're going to be partnering with her as well as we finalize metrics on measurement of Act 76. And it was really incredible to hear the progress that New Mexico has made. And I'm hoping to give you a real example of how our Building Bright Futures network and our State Advisory Council is helping support you all in that monitoring and accountability space right now, and what the opportunities are for the future. So for those of you who may not be as well versed in Building Bright Futures, and I'm going to ask if the host can give me screen sharing privileges as I start. But Building Bright Futures is Vermont's public and private partnership charged under Title 33, Chapter 46 as the primary advisor to Vermont's governor and the legislature on the well-being of kids and families statewide. We are specifically named as the Early Childhood State Advisory Council, both in state statute and the Federal Head Start Act. And in that way, we serve as a nonpartisan, independent entity charged with maintaining the vision and strategic plan for the system and monitoring and holding the system accountable to meeting the needs of kids and families. And I'm going to share my screen to just quickly show you what our network looks like. So on a monthly basis, we're bringing together over 450 partners across the state in every corner through 12 regional councils, 7 strategic plan committees, and a 23 governor-appointed state advisory council. And all of this work is using data and evidence to inform decision-making. And I hope what you hear from me today is much of what you heard from New Mexico and Drew about the importance of stakeholder engagement, the importance of holding our agency leaders, but also ourselves as the legislature and decision makers accountable to the vision and the strategic plans that we've set out, that we're continuously prioritizing how we think about creating change and for whom we are trying to make change for, and really thinking about continuous quality improvement. One of the slides I wanted to share with this group is around our advisement role in the system, and that we have committed as an entity and as a network to consistently be prioritizing evidence and data to inform decision-making. And when we were created back by Governor Douglas, he specifically said, we need an entity outside of state government that is a public and private partnership to support accountability so that we can, specific to the early childhood system, balance the priorities of the legislature, the administration, private partners, and families. So our job is to hold the system accountable to all of those stakeholders, the needs of children and families, and the system itself. Within that role, we compile, analyze, and disseminate the most up-to-date, high-quality data to inform decision-making, and that includes both quantitative numbers, but also qualitative data from families, providers, from folks in the system. It's a lot of those stories that we were talking about and that you heard New Mexico talk about as well. And we really operate as a broker of data and information to guide policy decision-making. And so when you're looking at our data portfolio on my screen right now, what you see at the top is the green box, and that is where you see our state and federal mandates that are charging us with monitoring, accountability, evaluation, and technical assistance across the system. So we are actually built into state statutes to monitor the Vermont Early Childhood Strategic Plan and to monitor change over time in the system itself. Act 76, which is the most recent child care bill, as many address it, also has specific language directly in the law designating Building Bright Futures as the entity responsible for monitoring and supporting continuous quality improvement and reporting back to the legislature. And I'll come back to that piece a little bit later. We also have federal dollars and federal requirements under the Preschool Development Grant for robust systems evaluation. And then we also spend quite a bit of time consulting with state agency leaders, both to help them identify performance measures, think about improving the quality of the data that they are collecting, and sometimes helping outline some of the data that they are really looking to provide to the legislature, as well as the limitations to that data. I'm not going to go through all of the tools by which we are capturing data and compiling things, but I do want to draw your attention to at least a couple that I heard from New Mexico and Drew. One was around having a spending inventory across state government to really be thinking critically about the gaps in how we are thinking about funding, where there may be duplicative funding. So we have spent a decent amount of time in the last 2 years creating a spending inventory that we are currently working on with partners in state government. And the other that I want to mention is a data dashboard. And as we are thinking about helping support Vermont's ability to know what the top indicators are that will tell us whether or not we're making an impact and where and how and when, we are in the process of also now taking that data and putting it into a public forward-facing dashboard that allows folks to see it in a meaningful and accessible way. I also want to mention some of the other dissemination mechanisms because there is a lot of data that is publicly available on the early childhood system, even broader than just childcare. And so one of the reports that we are legislatively mandated to provide you all with is called the State of Vermont's Children. This is something that comes out every January. We do a full data briefing that is recorded via webinar, and then we often are coming into policy committees to present some of the metrics and indicators that are specifically relevant to their bodies of work. So as you heard Drew say, Vermont actually has a lot of things in place that support the legislature's ability to have data-driven decision-making be a leading factor. Some of the others on the dissemination mechanisms are data briefs, reports, and needs assessments. And the last one I'll call your attention to is Vermont's Early Childhood Data and Policy Center. That is at vermontkidsdata.org. And that is where we are building that centralized repository of all of the different indicators across the early childhood system through that data dashboard. And that is what our website looks like when you head over there. So I know this committee is really interested in one real example for how we're thinking about monitoring in the current system. So I want to give the Act 76 specific example for you all and why this is an important case study for you. So before I outline the example, it's really important to name that it's not just about childcare, right? It's really about the importance of data to inform policy development and the law itself. And then after the law is passed, to be able to know whether there has been an impact and for whom. And so related to childcare and pre-K and after school, the legislature and so many stakeholders across our system this past year had so many questions about those programs and services. And based on the way that we have built our laws and regulations, it wasn't actually anyone's specific job under state law to be collecting very concrete specific indicators that would tell us how these programs are functioning, for when, for whom, and what those gaps were. And that is not to say that we don't collect a lot of data. We do. In state government and in the private sector, we are collecting so many indicators based on our state laws and based on federal data regulations. And I know you heard that from New Mexico as well, that that's a great place to start. The challenge is that as a state, we hadn't necessarily prioritized the indicators that we would need to have in place to inform your decision-making about how to improve different sections of the system. And so because of that, we really struggle to answer some of those basic questions about the number of kids that are enrolled in specific programs and being able to disaggregate that data by, it might be by demographics, by setting type, by program level quality, and geographic area. Really all of the different pieces of that data to be able to understand who's being served, where are they being served, how well are they being served. And I think that that is true across Vermont's system. That is not specific to early childhood. And so what was exciting about what the legislature did last session under Act 76, and there are several of your colleagues in the room who spearheaded this, is that the legislature in the actual piece of legislation named Building Bright Futures as the entity responsible for monitoring, for accountability, defining benchmarks and measures of success, and then coming back and reporting to your committees on an annual basis where we are and what that looks like, both from a quantitative perspective, but also qualitatively. And so what that means is that we are spending quite a bit of time reviewing what data is available across all of your areas of legislative intent and building out a data development agenda, which is what gaps are there in the system? What data do we have right now that could help us understand this impact? What data do we need to inform decision making? And then working with our agencies across the Child Development Division, the Agency of Education, to say to them, okay, based on what data exists, what is the narrative that we're able to tell? What proxy data might be available? And those have been really important and fruitful conversations. We've also convened private partners and some of our legislative leaders to again, ask these bigger questions. What are the top 3 to 5 indicators that we would need in order to measure, in order to know whether or not we've made the intended impact? And so we're actually using our State Advisory Council meeting on Monday to have a much broader look with our full board to say, again, what are those top 3 to 5 indicators that we have to measure here to make sure that those are included? And once we've identified and kind of narrowed down the list of benchmarks and indicators, then we'll go back to our state agency leaders and say, okay, do we have that data? And if we don't, then we will convene a different group of stakeholders to determine what the strategy is for how to collect that data. And then that final step is really making the data publicly available, both to you all, but also to stakeholders who are actively wanting to know what the impact of this law is related to childcare and pre-K. So the things that I would name that the legislature did really well and that I think are really important to do this well in the future is identifying an entity. Whose job is it to monitor related to that specific piece of legislation? It could be an entity like BBF, or it could be the administration in some ways. And I think what you heard from New Mexico is they have separate entity altogether that is supporting their legislative leaders in doing that. It does require partnership between the entity that's compiling data and the different agency partners, and a ton of capacity on behalf of the agency leaders and data teams to compile that information. And I'm going to screen share one more time so that you have a sense of when I say we are monitoring these indicators, what I really mean there. So specifically related to childcare, and I can imagine this is very hard for you to see in the room. But specifically for childcare, we'd be thinking about the capacity of programs, the number of children who are enrolled in those programs, whether or not we can disaggregate that information by demographic characteristics, by school district, capturing the number of available slots, the percent of children who are likely to need care, the quality of those programs. And so we have a list right now that we've compiled of over 45 key indicators that, again, collectively, stakeholders have said, this is what's important to measure. We are now in the process of narrowing that down to say, what are the things we absolutely have to measure related to this bill to know whether or not we are making a difference? And I want to draw your attention to one of the education outcomes related to childcare that folks have mentioned, which is Ready for Kindergarten, which is one way that Vermont has chosen to measure academic outcomes for our kids. And one of your colleagues from New Mexico said it really well. How much change would you expect to see in each of these indicators, and when would you expect to see it? And I think that's a really important piece of this discussion. If in Vermont, for the last 10 years, our rates of Ready for Kindergarten are between 84 and 86%, how much more change would we expect to see? Would we be looking at a full total, an aggregate, or would we really be looking to see whether or not we had made changes for specific subpopulations who weren't doing as well? And how do we think about that data? So I am going to pause there to see what questions folks have, but I think where we are in this process is that we have a really robust list of indicators, and we are now doing that stakeholder engagement, that convening to say, what are the top most important ones related to this law? And then working with the administration to say, do we have that data and how can we compile it and report it?
Thank you very much. I appreciate your presentation. You've shed some light on building bright futures that I wasn't aware of. I'm just curious that yours is a public-private partnership. Are you officially part of state government? Are you an independent nonprofit organization? Where do you lie?
Great question. We are an independent nonprofit. So we were strategically created outside of state government so that we would have that nonpartisan ability to be that kind of independent entity supporting data-driven decision-making and elevating the voice of communities.
Right. I'm looking at your website and I see you have a donate button and so on. Are you a 501c3?
We are.
Okay, good. That explains it. Good. It would be very helpful if you could forward a copy of your PowerPoint to our committee assistant, Lindsay, because it would be useful to put that out so that all the committee could refer back to it for the future. Questions, Representative Kornheiser.
Is anyone else? First question out of the gate every time. Okay. Morgan, thank you. Dora, thank you. I'm very, very excited that Building Bright Futures exists and does this work and has been doing this work so well for so long. My two questions are, how do you think, and this is an awkward position to put you in, but how do you think we could perhaps shift the structure of the legislative process so that we paid more attention to you? And my second question is, again, I'm really glad you exist. The idea of duplicating Building Bright Futures for every single sector seems not possible. And so do you have sort of ideas for how we could, I don't know, create the amazingness that is Building Bright Futures for places other than childhood?
Great questions, Representative. The first is super awkward, but I feel like because we sit right in between state government and the legislature and the private, we live in that uncomfortable space. So I'm going to bear with you. So, I think there are several things that we have brainstormed as a team for how the legislative committees could help support, and make recommendations that would move this work forward based on the work that we are doing at Building Bright Futures. I do want to commend the committees, at least the policy committees that we currently work with. We do spend a decent amount of time in the House Committee on Human Services and Senate Health and Welfare and in both ed committees. But I do think for this committee to be able to raise awareness that in some ways Building Bright Futures is able to support and build the capacity of the legislature in this data space. And that we shouldn't at this moment be duplicating efforts inside of the legislature, but how can you utilize us to both make sure that we are capturing the data that you need to inform decision-making, or at least making the connections with the people who are connected or collecting that data, but also making sure that as your committees are tackling issues related to early childhood, again, not specific to childcare, that we are brought in as a resource. Maybe it's not for formal testimony, but if you have questions about what data exists, that we can help connect those dots. So at Building Bright Futures, when we say early childhood, most people think childcare, or they think childcare and pre-K. And what our role is to hold the vision and strategic plan for all of the early childhood system, which really involves all of the resources, services, and supports that are in place for kids and families prenatal to age 8. It might be childcare, it might be early intervention and special education, nutrition, housing, mental health, after school and summer care. So I want to just offer that we are a resource. We are in place to both build the capacity and support the legislature and state government to do that data-driven decision-making. And we can help support the identification of data that's there, but also help build strategies for data that is not there. The second question, is a little bit tougher to answer because, we were strategically created over 10 years ago to serve in this role. And I think that over the last 5 years, we've really stepped into data-driven decision-making in a different way and have a different level of capacity to support that. But I think internally within the legislature, we do have a couple of opportunities for consideration in thinking about your processes and systems that I think Drew mentioned as well, that I'd love to mention. So for example, related to each piece of legislation that you are all finalizing, could you potentially have some sort of a protocol where you have that list of, okay, did we identify an entity that's responsible for data collection and monitoring? And even if it's not a Building Bright Futures, is it one of the agencies? Is it another private partner that has that content knowledge or expertise or is already collecting data in that area? And funding to ensure that there's capacity for that entity to be truly responsible. It also makes me think about, in terms of the legislative procedures itself, without or in the absence of what New Mexico has, which is truly phenomenal, is there a point person within each legislative committee who can ensure that the reports that you are all getting from so many different entities are reviewed and that you have the time and capacity to review the key data in each of your respective committees? And especially related to new legislation, when you're coming in and saying, we have so many incredible, great ideas this session, we have new energy around this new thing. How do we operate in a continuous quality improvement framework where we're actually committing to using the data we've captured on the impact of that legislation to say, okay, here was the intent. Here's what we did in terms of implementation. Here's where we are now. What does that mean? Are we, I also appreciated New Mexico saying they were willing to let go of certain things that were not working well. I think that's an opportunity for growth for Vermont, for us to be able to let go of things that are not working well and to transition and really think about how to either address the challenges that we've seen based on the law or the policy or implementation of service provision, or to be able to let it go.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very, very much for your presentation, and a lot of the information that you presented to us today is very helpful for us to give us things to think about as we approach the problem on our plate at this point. So again, thank you very, very much for your presentation today.
Thank you all.
As we move on to the next agenda item today, current practices regarding legislative reports and communication. We're going to learn all the things that we are doing that we don't really realize that we're doing. And so this is Jen Carby, who is the head of our legislative council at this point.
She's online.
Okay. All right.
Good afternoon. As Senator Brock said, I am Jen Carby. I'm the Director and Chief Counsel of the Office of Legislative Counsel. And I brought today some displays I'll put up on the screen about the information that Legislative Counsel currently tracks and what happens with that under our existing processes. I think you'll see we do collect a fair amount of information. It's all quite manual. So the first thing I'm going to put up is our act summary template. So every year, right after the legislative session ends or as it's ending, the attorneys are taking all of the bills that have passed both chambers and either are on their way to the governor have been signed, and we write an act summary. You've probably seen those posted on the website. We put out a compilation of those. There's also a version that we keep just in-house, and that is, so I'm going to put up a blank form of what we do for our act summary template. And this form is what we use. It starts out with a little disclaimer that I think is always printed in the books, but and I've just made this, taken out all the references to act numbers and topics, because what I want to show you is what comes afterward. And this is a bunch of information that this is just part of our form, says will not be part of the official act summary, but is useful to staff in tracking information. And this directions to our colleagues to be as specific as possible to try to pinpoint exactly where these provisions lie. So the things that we're collecting in here are new, amended, or deleted prospective repeals. This is what people often refer to as a sunset. So were there any provisions set up in the bill that sunset in the future? And this is really like, after January 1st of an upcoming year. So we're setting up anything that is going to, that we need to revisit, or the legislature may need to revisit before it gets repealed. And we would fill in for each act the section, the subject area, the specific topic, and then kind of what happened. Was it a new, amended, or deleted prospective repeal? And we have new, amended, or deleted reports. These are reports to the General Assembly or to a legislative body. And this is really, regardless of whether it's connected to a new committee, we also try to track oral as well as written reports, requests for draft legislation, testimony. If there's supposed to be some kind of a check back in with the legislature that you set up in legislation, that's what we're collecting here. And we're going to focus more on this in a minute. But here you can see the information we're collecting is which section of the bill did it come from, what is the topic, who is responsible for the report, who gets the report in the legislature. And if it just says General Assembly, then we're asking whoever drafted the bill to kind of preview which committees are likely to be interested in receiving that. When is it due? What's the frequency? Is this an annual report requirement? Is this a one-time report, some other frequency? Is this a new report requirement? Is it one that's been amended or even deleted? And if there's an amendment, please explain the changes. And then finally, does the act specify that the report notwithstands 2 VSA section 20D, which is the provision in statute that says that any kind of ongoing report requirement of the executive branch is supposed to sunset after 5 years. And you'll see later there's another process where we're trying to track those reports that are report repeals that are coming up so that the legislature has a chance to revisit and see if you wanted to keep it indefinitely. All right, then this is new, and I think you heard this as a recommendation from the auditor's office at a previous meeting. This is something that was instituted by LCAR earlier this year. And this is for us to start prospectively tracking new or amended rulemaking authority. Again, where in the bill was it? What's the topic? Which committees of jurisdiction are going to be the ones to should receive copies of the rule? Who is the adopting agency? Is this a new rulemaking requirement or an amendment to an existing rulemaking requirement? Is rulemaking mandatory or permissive? And are there any relevant dates? And then any other notes if there's, for example, emergency rule that is authorized, transferring authority, what type of amendments, things like that. Then we get to new or amended committees, work groups, task forces, choose your name, with legislative membership, legislative appointments, and or involvement by legislative staff, both ongoing and interim. And this is part of, I think, a number of offices try to track this information, sometimes for somewhat different purposes, like the House and Senate offices need to know whether members need to be appointed. Legislative operations needs to know if staffing will be necessary and how many committee assistants might need to be brought back over the summer. In addition to us trying to understand the workload for for my staff and for the joint fiscal staff over the summer. And then finally, we have a provision we call statutory revision authority. And this is where sometimes a bill will direct my office to make certain changes to the statutes during our annual summer statutory revision process, summer and fall, which the short version is where we work with the publisher to take everything that you enacted during the legislative session and make sure it gets incorporated appropriately into the Vermont statutes annotated. And sometimes there might be, for example, that an agency's name has changed. So there might be a directive to my office to change that name everywhere it appears, either across the statutes or just in the supplements, which are the more recently amended statutory sections. So we track that there so that we can be referring to that list when we're doing statutory revision. All right, so that's the information, take this one down, that we collect. And I have just a quick example that I will show you of one of mine from this year, just to see they're not usually populating every single provision, But this was my act summary for Act 61. It's just a brief summary of what the act does. There were no prospective repeals, but there is a report requirement, an update on the status of rulemaking for the unused drug repository program from the Agency of Human Services to a number of committees. It's due as part of the FY24 budget adjustment presentation, one time. It's new and it doesn't need to doesn't need to really get into the question of notwithstanding because it's a one-time report. There's also rulemaking. That was a big part of the act itself, was directing agency rulemaking. So I noted the section of the bill as well as which statute is implicated. What is the topic? It's this unused drug repository program. Here again are committees that would be interested or the most interested. It's the Agency of Human Services that's directed to do the rulemaking. It's a new requirement and it is mandatory with that update required as part of the budget adjustment presentation. And then there were no committees, no statutory revision authority. So the information that gets filled in on those, on the act summary and the different charts, makes its way to a few different people in my office, depending on the topic. So the act summaries themselves go to our drafting operations unit, but then they create the clean version of just the act summary itself that they then post online. Separately, those charts go to Katie McLinn, who handles the sunsets and tracks those in a spreadsheet, and who also does all of the report stuff, which is what I'm going to show you next. It also goes to Anthea Dexter Cooper, who handles is prospectively as of this year, creating that rulemaking database and trying to keep track of those. And then the statutory revision piece gets sent out to the attorneys as part of getting the files to review for the statutory revision process over the summer. And anything about the committees is we're trying to coordinate with the other offices. So the next thing I will show you, Katie, I'm going to focus now just on the reports. Katie loads all the information. First, she double checks all of the information. So for every act summary, it's usually 80 to 100 act summaries, she goes through and checks the acts against what is in the act summary chart about the reports to make sure that all of the information that the attorney has filled in accurately reflects what she sees when she reads it, and that they haven't missed any reports or mischaracterized anything. So she does that double check, that verification, and sometimes she needs to make changes there. And then she types it all into a database that's created in-house about 10 years ago. It's very clunky. And I'm going to show you then, I'm not going to show you, I don't think I have what it actually, I do have. So I focused on the Senate Health and Welfare Committee because it's where I spend a lot of my time, so I'm familiar with it. And they get a lot of reports. So this is what it looks like if you run a report of the reports database. Whoops. Where did I go here? This is what it looks like if you run a report under Senate Health and Welfare in the reports database. It pulls up this information. So you can see, and it goes on for a while about what all of the different reports are that are in statute and one-time reports. So this is all based on, a number of years at this point of filling in this information in the spreadsheet. Whoops. And you can see that it sorts by area of law. Oops, guess moved over. Act number, bill number, section number, what year, a statutory section if there is one, area of law, the topic, who the report is from, who the report goes to, report frequency, if there's an expiration listed for the report, whether it notwithstands 20 VSA section 20D, year if there's only 1 year that the report is supposed to be due, and whether it is a repealed or expired report requirement. When we run reports from this, we should be able to suppress the repealed ones, although it doesn't always work. So this is what it looks like if you try to figure out what reports come to the Senate Health and Welfare Committee. From here, I will take you to a couple of what I call cleaned up versions. So Mike Ferrant and his team in legislative operations have helped us out with creating kind of cleaner versions of that document. Oops, she's very, very small. But, all right. So now it's in a cleaner, this is, I think, a 21-page document. Yes, a 21-page document of reports due to the Senate Health and Welfare Committee. This was run in 2019, so this was a point in time. And so at this point, we have the attorneys entering the information into the act summaries, Katie double checking the information, typing it into the database, running a report from the database, giving the report for each of the committees to legislative operations to create this version. But when committees want to know what reports are coming in, this isn't a particularly user-friendly document for them to use. So I have a couple of years worth of that one, but I won't bore you with all of them. So then Katie and I take that, at least for our committees, and I don't think every committee does this, but our committees tend to, the Health and Human Services and Senate Health and Welfare committees tend to be very interested in which reports are coming in. And so we create separate charts for them of what they're actually expecting. We typically make them shortly before the session starts. So we're trying to capture basically what came in since you left in May or June and what is coming in the first few months of the legislative session. And so that is,
As a member of those committees, that is important. Yeah. They even come and explain it. Katie comes and talks to us.
yep, we usually come in, we usually tag team the presentations. So here is the 1% Health and Welfare from later 2021 to early 2022. And we put these in chronological order, which again is a manual. It's all manual. And we're typing in the acts and the statute, what the topic is, who it's coming from, and when it's due. And then we're going on to the legislative reports page and trying to see if it has been, if we can tell if it's been submitted. If it's been submitted and posted, we then put in a hyperlink here for each one of the reports. So these are and you'll see on some of them that may not have been posted or may be getting posted on an external website like the Attorney General's website or the Green Mountain Care Board website. Some of them just hadn't come in yet when we put this together. So you can see in this one, we had last updated it. We try to update it particularly around the January 15th date, when a lot of reports come in, and then it usually, I think that they flood the report submission website or inbox. So it may take a few days for those to get posted. So we try to go in and update, but at some point, I will admit during the session, we stopped focusing on this because we're busy with the legislation you're working on. So this one for Senate Health and Welfare is kind of a combination of the ones due to human services and healthcare, but we also create separate ones, and there is some overlap. So we have to sort of back out which ones are due to each of the committees. And we create individual ones for each of the committees. So as I said, I don't think many committees do this, although I don't know because I only know the ones that I work on. But for example, here's the one, it was 4 pages instead of 8 pages of reports that were just due to House Human Services. I know we typically push pretty hard to get put on the agenda in these committees to walk them through this. It's not always anybody's favorite way to spend a period of committee time. So it is a process and a little bit awkward for us to be saying, please let us come in and tell you about the things that you asked for. But we do try, or at least provide them with the list. So I'll pause there for a minute. I have a couple of other ones to talk about that aren't as time intensive from my presentation perspective. But just know that what I just presented is probably hundreds of hours of work on an annual basis.
One quick question is, I have seen this document or the information related to it previously, but in all the years that I've been in the legislature, which is all too many, I've not gone to a single committee meeting where this has been presented.
I'm not sure the committees that you serve on have asked or,
That leads to my next question. Is this information available to the public so that the public can easily look at it? Where? Without an open records request?
when we create, like when Katie and I create this document, yes, it gets posted on the committee webpage and is publicly available. One thing I do want to note, especially given how manual the process is that while we try to be as complete as possible, this should not be, the documents we create in this area should not be relied on as an exhaustive list. I know there's been requests or suggestions from the administration in the past that legislative council come up with a list of all of the reports that are due. And I would be very concerned that our failure to include one would be deemed as excusing an agency or department from creating the report. So I would be very reluctant to have us be the authoritative source.
They say it should, on the committee page, is the entire report of all of the reports that all of the committees are required to produce or will be producing, is that in one place? So that a member of the public can say, what's coming in from all these places, or do they have to go committee by committee to find it?
They would need to go committee by committee, and most of them, I don't believe, I don't think a lot of the information is posted in them, because the earlier version that I showed you, even the cleaned up version from Mike Ferrant's team, is not especially user-friendly if you don't know what you're looking at. And so that's why that's why Katie and I have created the ones that we do. Because I don't know that this is particularly helpful.
Well, I think the information, though, would be valuable to a lot of people ranging from lobbyists to others who are just interested in government. The fact that we have all these reports due, I don't think most people realize it, and to have to hunt and peck through a committee list that may or may not be there to find it. I would just raise the question to you, is this something that might be able, even though it maybe need a primer to able to understand what's in it, could be a very valuable document that would be worth having. And the next question I have is that when we have legislation that's passed that says that once an agency finishes a project or once an agency is ready to ask for money for the next stage of a process, they need to run it by a particular committee to have an approval or a concurrence. How is that communicated?
I'm not sure.
Does it appear, for example, on your sheet? Your sheet would indicate reports that are supposed to be done. How about actions that committees are supposed to take to move legislation along to the next stage? Is that reported anywhere?
Not if it isn't either some sort of either report or a prospective repeal.
Okay.
So I think sometimes we will draft things in the form of, come back to the committee with such and such information that would get captured as a report.
Well, I raise it, for example, the Joint Information Technology Oversight Committee, and this is something that I've been grappling with as the chair of that, is legislation will be passed that says there'll be an appropriation of X number of dollars that will be sliced into multiple tranches, one of which will have to be done by a certain date, and the results of it presented to the committees of jurisdiction and also the Joint Information Technology Committee so that can approve and concur. And my question is there a mechanism that all the committees, like the Joint Information Technology Committee, is made aware of the fact that they have this responsibility? And the reason I ask it is because I've run into a situation where that's not happened.
Right. No, I think the onus in that case is on the agency or department to be communicating that they are presenting the information and that the next stage has been triggered. That is not captured by what we do.
Okay.
Because I just wanted to make a comment on that. Remember that Ledge Council, the attorneys at Ledge Council are doing this work because they see it as important, not because they've been asked to do it. So it's not like
No,
they're
absolutely,
meeting.
no, absolutely. That's my question is, have they been asked to do it?
No.
And the answer is no, and that's on us.
Right, although I will tell you that I am reluctant to be asked to do more without coming up with a way to streamline the process.
Well, that again is obviously an issue, is because I'm looking at what essentially is taking a major function and perhaps putting it on Excel spreadsheets, which always represents a danger.
Right.
Right. And I think Josie also prepared some information.
And I see Josie's hand is up as also. Representative Levitt.
Hi there. Let me put my hand down. Jen, I love everything that you just said, and I was asked to sort of look at some of I was looking at the reports due to the House Committee on Agriculture and Forestry, because for me, it was easy. That's my committee, not that many reports. This is phenomenally difficult, especially for a newbie. I learned I was like, I couldn't write fast enough when Jen was presenting something. I didn't know where to look for this. So, and I've only been in a year. But there does seem to be, from my attempts at trying to find this data, it is not intuitive. It is unwieldy at best. It is gargantuan on a good day. And until 2019, I believe, or 2018, you can go to your committee and there's a reports page, a tab, and then you can see what reports have come in. Once I figured that out, I was like, okay, this is a lot easier, but there's still things that we're not finding. So, I could find out for like petroleum cleanup fund, there was supposed to be a report. We got the report January 2020. I don't recall, although I do think Michael O'Grady from Ledge Council came in very early on and said, these are reports that are due to you. And it was done quickly in a way, and I'm not criticizing him because there's just so much that he has to do and so many committees he needs to advise. I feel like my committee, for sure, we met with him, we went over this, we never went back to it again. And that's on all of us. I'm not blaming my chair or my vice chair. We never went back to it. And I think there needs to be sort of things in place where we're checking in maybe monthly for an hour. Maybe we have a working lunch and we go over like, okay, what reports are we expecting? Are they in? Are they not in? Who do we need to reach out to find out where is this report? Why is it late? How come we didn't get it? And I think that would be enormously helpful. And I think it would also be a really good way for the committee to understand what the past versions of that committee has done and what's owed them. So I was not hugely successful in sort of walking three bills through, except to sort of just walk my own frustration through about not knowing the system and not necessarily knowing who to reach out to about this without seeming like a pest. And I had no idea that Ledge Council did so much up front with what Jen was talking about at the very beginning of her presentation. And I think we can do better. And I don't think it's rocket science. I think it's digging in and learning the system and then figuring out where you're getting stuck and then calling in the right people to offer assistance. Because I do think it's really important to know what reports, I think it's really important to read the reports that came into your committee, because I know my committee has changed very much because we've added food resiliency. So our reports are very different last session than they've ever been because we had so much universal school meals reporting that was due to us. So anyway, so that is my presentation essentially. Is it was frustrating. I felt somewhat overwhelmed and remarkably ill-equipped and that I don't blame anybody but me for that. But I think it would be great if Ledge Council could come to every committee at the beginning of the session and say, this is what's owed you. This is how you find it. This is how you keep up with it. And then put the onus on us.
And I will tell you, Katie and I do that for the ones that the committees that we work with. It probably takes approximately 10 hours to put the the report with the links in it together, even after all the information has been created. So I don't, just because there's so much that we find that, or reports have come in that we didn't even know about. So I'm hesitant to say, yes, all of the attorneys in the office will build that into their winter planning, but we can
I'm not even
certainly.
suggesting that, Jen. I'm really suggesting you teach us, it's sort of like, teach us how to fish. So we understand how to go find our own reports. So we're not always relying on you all to do something that feels like it's pulling you off the scope of what we really need you for, which is when we're in session, we need you to help us with legislation. But if you could teach everyone sort of like, this is where you can go, you can check here and here and here. And then it's on us, I think. I mean, maybe I'm being unrealistic because I don't have a committee that gets as many reports as a lot of your committees. So that might be easier for me to say. And that's a lot of time. And thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
My first question, Jen, is do you want a better piece of database software? Because it seems like that Word form that you showed us could just feed a database in like even some 1990s technology.
Yes, we would love a better database. I don't know how to make that happen. And it's no fault of our IT team. It's, I think, something that
it's something
you need an investment in.
Okay. And have you but you haven't spent much time looking into what that might look like if you wanted it. Okay, great. Okay.
I think I'll put in a legislative drafting request to create
First.
like statute to get us that.
That seems like a low threshold win we could probably get through.
I think it's a particularly important item, and it's not just for us individually or for committee chairs individually. I think the public also has a need to know what reports are coming and to where they're going and when are they due. And right now, there isn't an easy way to do that. So this is just something for us to think about. And it's nothing that by any means, any criticism of Ledge Council, because I think you've done a wonderful job in getting us where we are.
So I want to show you two more things.
I just have one other.
Yes, and then I guess first stop in about 2 minutes because I have to pick my daughter up.
Oh, go for it then. Go for it. Go forth. I will not.
But I'm happy to be followed up with. So if any of you want to reach out to me.
Please go ahead then.
All right, let me show you two other quick things. One of which is a list of expiring reports. So I mentioned that 2 VSA 20D expiring, that reports expire after 5 years. So this is something that may look familiar to some of you who were here a few years ago. This is something every other year. This is something Tucker Anderson in my office tracks and puts together. He goes through for each committee. You can see down at the bottom, there are links to all of the committees. So there's a spreadsheet for each committee. These are the reports in their subject area that are coming to them that are scheduled to, they either have recently expired or are scheduled to expire. And the committee is supposed to, for each one of these, answer either the report is no longer useful and should just go ahead and be repealed, or it's useful, but it's not useful necessarily forever. And it should be reviewed again at the next reports review, or this is an absolutely fundamental report and it should be permanently required. And let's just exempt it from 2 VSA section 20D. And so this again is another one that we try to focus the committees on to get their attention to make these decisions about which reports can tail off, which ones should be revisited in a few years, and which ones should be maintained permanently. So this is another, again, manual process that gets, I think, important information and things you want to be looking at, but it's also things we track. And then the other one also in Tucker's area is the exemptions to the Public Records Act that are in statutes. This is kind of new, amended, and repealed reports. Let me put this one up. And he puts this table together every year because this gets published in Title I of Vermont statutes annotated in the supplement. This is a 12-page list of all of some of them are the very easily found 1 VSA section 317C exemptions. That's where the list of actual exemptions in the Public Records Act is, but the rest of them are spread throughout the statutes and may say that they are They may specifically say they are exempt from public inspection and copying under the Public Records Act, or they may say the information shall be kept confidential, or they may say any variety of things. And so Tucker goes through all of the acts every year to look for language that would suggest a Public Records Act exemption so that he can update this list. There are, sorry for making you dizzy, 280, currently 288.
Great. Well, thank you very much again. Are there any questions? We have a couple minutes, just in case, before we move on to the next.
Just a quick one. So I'm sorry, just to clarify that last part, 288 public reports that are going potentially exempted from.
Nope, these are statutory, no, this is the most current list of statutory provisions that create an exemption from the Public Records Act. So either information is withheld or information is redacted or information is not acknowledged as existing, depending on how it's phrased.
Every section.
Typically, although there is a new provision added a few years ago, I think as of 2019, every Public Records Act exemption expires after 5 years, similar to the ongoing reports requirement. And so this year will be the first year that Tucker is also in with a list of, here are the Public Records Act exemptions that are due to expire. Do you want to keep them? So that's another, be on the lookout for that list as well. He says there's only 13 that are due for, up for potential sunset this year.
I'd like to offer something before we go on to the next agenda item, but Jen doesn't need to be here for it, so.
Okay.
I have something for Jen. Unfortunately. I would suggest that we do a data-driven analysis before you leave the spreadsheet world. Spreadsheets are very accessible, not just for the public, but for anybody in your staff who needs to enter those. And with succession planning, I would be sorry to see you go to a database format that requires lots of training.
So I will just pause you to say that the reports, the very, very clunky one is not Excel. It's an actual database. It was a in-house built database. Excel was floated sometimes, but there was concern, I think, about just the volume and how wonky it would be. But yes, I agree that Excel, we have a proven track record with some of these other ones in Excel that I think has been successful.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Again, Jen, thank you very, very much.
Sure, and I'm happy to come back or talk to folks offline if that's all.
Thank you for all the work you do.
Pass that along to my team.
Can I offer something on this topic?
Yes.
Okay. Just wanted to say, so on Ways and Means, we have a committee assistant who's permanent staff, which puts us in sort of a different committee position. And some committees have sort of retained staff from year to year, but I think that's pretty rare. And so she brings a list of all of the reports to all of our agenda setting meetings. And that's just sort of part of her process of helping us set the agenda. But I don't think that's standard protocol for committee assistants.
No.
But I think it could very easily become standard protocol for committee assistants, just in terms of like an easy win as part of their training when they're setting agendas with their chairs. And I think that's just, and I think there are a lot of things like that that might be helpful to look at that are sort of, Jessica's told me things her committee assistant does, but I'm like, oh gosh, that would be amazing. And just how much we're not necessarily sharing those best practices for accountability that committee assistants are just carrying on their own because of their own initiative.
Well, thank you. We move along to our next agenda item. We have Will Clark, who's a program principal at the Center for Legislative Strengthening at NCSL, who's back visiting with us again today. Will?
Good afternoon. It's good to see you all again. For the record, Will Clark, National Conference of State Legislatures. And last month, I met with you all with my colleague Carrington Skinner. We provided you all with some information regarding performance management and program evaluation. And as part of that presentation, we got some questions from the committee. And so we did some digging around, some research, and provided you all with some responses to those questions. And so today I was planning to just go over some of the work that I submitted to you all, and then just let you know that I'm available for questions today or ongoing if you get a chance to look at those materials and want to reach out. All right. So I had 4 questions from the committee last month. And so one was to share a list of legislative audit shops with information about their functions and directives. And so as part of that, I provided the committee with this list. It's a PDF document, and it has the 35 different state legislative audit committees, just a link to each one, and then just a little bit of information about their scope and their duties and their formation. So again, just quite a bit of information there, just 35 states worth. But if you're interested in a particular state, you can go and check those out. And so, for example, if you have a state nearby that you're pretty similar to, or you have worked with before, or are aware of their practices, you can look that up. And then there was also a request to share any states that have full-time all-year government accountability committees. And so through our research, generally what we found is that most states use their legislative audit shops as their full-time year-round committee for accountability. And then, as we discussed in our presentation, these duties are also fulfilled by administrative rules review committees, as well as sunset committees. So you're all familiar with those practices. So a lot of states combine those 3 into a kind of a trifecta with their audit shops and then their administrative rules review specifically. But there were some interesting examples. So of the states that don't have a legislative audit shop, we looked a little bit closer at those. So there's kind of, it's some different approaches, but one of the more common ones is for maybe an audit subcommittee or a committee under another name, but generally a committee that's formed to receive information from the auditor. So even if the auditor is independently elected or governor appointed, then there's still a committee that's dedicated to receiving that information. So you have Indiana, Massachusetts, and North Dakota and Oregon are some examples of those. So they don't necessarily direct the activities of the auditor, but they're a place to gather that information and then to process it. I think 2 of the more pertinent examples that I found in terms of the work that you all are doing are in Missouri and Oklahoma. So there's Missouri, there's the Joint Committee on Government Accountability, and they're more focused on inefficiencies, fraud, misconduct. So more of a, maybe more punitive, maybe more resource-based, but it's just an example of a way that you could structure a committee to look at information, to look at agencies. So just one particular lens. And then Oklahoma has the Agency Performance and Accountability Commission. And so then it looks like they function, I haven't reached out to Oklahoma to talk more about their shop, but they focus more on performance audits. So they're not an actual audit shop, but they perform similar work. So that's two different examples of year-round committees that you could take a look at. North Carolina used to have the Program Evaluation Division, and they do a lot of activities as well, or they used to do a lot of activities that seemed comparable to what this committee is looking at, but they were dissolved in 2021. And the reason given on their website was to give members more involvement in the oversight process. I haven't followed up with them to see what that means, but they still have some of their resources available. So if you're curious to just see how it was set up, some of their activities to get ideas, you can go and check that out. You also asked for some summaries of states in the Governing for Results Network. That was more of what Carrington, my colleague, talked about during the presentation that we gave. And so the page. In terms of that, we provided a link to the webpage that discusses that. And so they actually, his center, so he works in a separate center from me, they break up the work that states are doing in that Program Evaluation Network by activity or by a certain type of trait or component, and then they give examples. So you can come here to this webpage and look at different states from the network and some of the things they're doing and get specific examples again from there. And then the fourth request was for states that are providing return on investment for performance management efforts. This one was a little more challenging to find examples for. One of the main examples that I did find and that I discussed in the presentation last month was on Texas's Sunset Advisory Commission. And on their webpage, they specifically outline kind of resources that they say they've saved the state. And I believe in some of their reports that breaks that down more specifically. And then the Oklahoma Legislative Office for Fiscal Transparency, also they provide reports on this type of thing. This might be a little more akin to what the work that you all are doing. And so it might be a little bit more relevant. And they work with the committee that I mentioned above that was in Oklahoma, the Agency Performance and Accountability Commission. So they're doing some interesting work that you might find useful as you're deliberating. And then I did find an example, it's dated, it's from 2009, but it's an example where the legislature directed the Washington State Institute for Public Policy to conduct return on investment. And so in that report, you can see, I believe it's an ongoing study. And what they ended up doing was they broke topics out and then looked at those. So maybe they looked at public health, they looked at teen health, things like that, and ways to save money in the long term, and looking at the effectiveness of government programs. And in my search for return on investment, that's more of what I found. It looks like when states conduct those types of analyses, they're typically geared towards a very specific topic or a general topic like higher education or transportation. So there are examples of those. I could go back and find more for you for specific topics, but in terms of a more general return on investment for performance measurement, those are some examples that I found. And then lastly, just as a little bonus, I included some guides, some handbooks from different states that release information for their members on conducting oversight. So if you're interested in any of these states, you can go and take a look at that. Some of it's more general, but others is more specific. So they have things like adding measures to the budget process, and then also, I think, guidance for specific committees as well. So these are just some of the resources we included. As I said, happy to answer questions today about the information that I've provided to you all, and also happy to continue conversation moving forward.
Well, thank you very, very much. Just a question, Lindsay, do we have the document that we have on the screen?
Just requested it.
Okay, good.
It looks like it was in the parts of it were in the body of the email back on the 11th, but I don't have exactly that one.
Well, for those members of the committee who haven't seen the document that we've been discussing, it will be up on our website so you can look at it, because there are some links that are quite useful to us. Are there questions for Bill?
Thank you. I do have.
You have a question?
Yes, I was.
Representative Carter.
Will, did you in your searching come across any legislatures that had sort of requirements on specific format for legislative drafting with a focus on intent or purpose or desired outcomes? Like, have you come across anything where the onus is on the legislators to do something about this?
Nothing specifically in a general sense like that. I do know that there are states that provide clauses in bills for that type of thing. So they'll say, come back in 2 years to, the agency will write a report about this particular issue. So for example, if they had a bill that was giving a lot of money to a health program, then one of the requirements in the bill would be for the agency to develop a report and then report back to the legislature in a year and a half. So I think a lot of states are using it as more of an active measure for specific bills, but I haven't seen a general across the board type of rule for legislatures, but I can definitely look into that for you.
Thanks.
Further questions? Well, great. This is very, very helpful. Some of the links that you provided, we need to delve into in more depth, and they will no doubt create further questions down the road. But I want to thank you and your colleagues for all the work that you've done in supporting us. It's made our job a lot easier. So thank you again.
Yeah, happy to help and yeah, happy to continue this conversation. So thank you for having me.
Great, thanks so much. Now we go to the highlight of our presentation in the afternoon. We're going to hear from the State Auditor's Office and Tim Ash, Deputy State Auditor, who is no stranger to the General Assembly.
I don't think you're supposed to play favorite.
Well, and with your glasses on, because I can't read anything anymore, okay, but we'll look, I'm familiar. Tim Ash, Deputy State Auditor for the record, and I've been watching this remotely all day, and it's one of the more interesting off-season committee meetings I've watched. And no, the presentation from New Mexico in particular was, I thought, an outstanding example of an approach that seems to be, people are hungry for that kind of level of analysis. So there's a memo for me on your committee page, and I don't want to ruin what has been a good afternoon by droning on. So I'm just going to kind of breeze through, but just recommend that you take a look at this when you get a chance, and it'll touch on all the themes that I referred to.
I don't see the memo. Oh,
I always wait for her, okay.
okay, great, cool.
Yes.
It's imminently going to be.
Absolutely.
Sorry to
It's not
interrupt him.
No.
It's halfway here.
No, this is good. But I think I'm going to just talk a little bit brief overview, and then I'll just get to the key pieces. I think the first is the discussion today, in my opinion, is an example of how assigning one committee like the Government Accountability Committee to do all of government accountability work for the legislature is just not enough. It's insufficient. And the work here is to be commended. The other is that whenever you are moving forward with strategies, the extent to which they are systematized rather than relying on moments of inspiration by a committee, a legislator, or a particular staff member, I think you're heading in the right direction. So we have about 6 general areas that we talk about in the memo. The first is the NCSL report that the legislature received in 2019. Those of you who are here will remember we were trying to figure out how to restructure staff and the oversight of staff. It helped create the Joint Legislative Management Committee, which I believe still exists. And it was really focused on issues like compensation and oversight and job titles, things like that. But there was a passage in there that was specifically related to performance auditing and program evaluation. And in that passage, NCSL and Will's peers mentioned that 80% of state legislatures have in-house staff capacity for either direct performance auditing, like what our office does, or for the level of in-depth program evaluation that you heard from in New Mexico, and singled Vermont out as an outlier by not having those. Now, of course, from time to time, JFO and the Ledge Council do perform those types of duties, but not in a dedicated, systematic way. From my observation, having been here for 12 years, one of the things the legislature was loath to do was increase its own resources. And there was a period of time, some of you will remember, when legislative leadership were very determined not to have the legislative budget grow faster than the general budget. However, that has a double effect if you start from a very lowly resourced place, because it means you didn't have what you needed to begin with, and then you're limiting your ability to catch up and have a real balance of powers kind of branch from the legislative point of view. So whether this committee thinks it needs to develop in-house performance auditing like what the auditor's office does, or to give our office more resources for such work, or bolster the resources at JFO or Ledge Council, it will take more money. And the more money piece is the thing that I hope this committee will encourage your peers to move past that old way of thinking that somehow we have to be really very, very cautious about these kinds of resources. I think the shortchanging of that kind of an analytic in-house capacity is one of the great limitations of the legislature. It leaves you dependent on the administration, as good faith as their presentations may be, and interest groups, same with them. They are not neutral parties and they are not nonpartisan entities the way your own staff are. I touched on this briefly the last time we were here, which is about making sure audit findings are addressed. I'll give two quick examples of where the legislature comes in with this. The dam safety audit we did in 2022 pointed out that the Department of Environmental Conservation was due to have dam safety rules, which related to both private and publicly owned dams. It had increased responsibilities, expectations, timeframes to remediate problems when they were identified. Those rules were supposed to be in place July 1 of 2022. When we did our audit, we knew that at that point they hadn't even started, which meant there was no chance they could comply with the legislature's directive. We are now in October of 2023. They have still not initiated by submitting to LCAR those rules. Now, we lucked out with the flooding in July. The dams held. In the next storm, if a dam doesn't hold and people are injured, killed, property is damaged, the legislature is in the awkward position of sort of knowing that its own mandate to protect people and property has not been followed. Now, there may be good reasons for all that. However, there is no single entity in the legislature responsible for kind of owning that issue. Our audit in 2023 of Dale pointed out that there is an annual requirement that Dale inspect assisted living facilities and residential care homes, but that Dale has operated on an every 2-year basis. So we have our most vulnerable older Vermonters in facilities where sometimes things are not being maintained in a safe way. Our office brought that forward to policy committees who I think were sympathetic to the situation and wanting things to be resolved, but nothing has actually changed in that regard. If someone is seriously injured or were to die in a facility that is not inspected as the legislature required in statute, that raises some liability issues for the state. And so from our point of view, it's not that legislators aren't interested in seeing those findings addressed. It's that there's a bit of diffuse responsibility. Everyone says, oh yeah, this is good. Someone should fix that. And everyone's kind of pointing like this, thinking someone else will take care of it. And I think it's because many legislators don't appreciate we cannot compel the changes that we recommend. That can only be done by the executive branch agencies themselves or the legislature through some mechanism doing something about it. So we have some recommendations in general about how that might get tightened up so that those important audit findings, sometimes, by the way, which come from the federal government, not just from our office, get followed. I won't belabor the issue on our outcomes report analysis, other than to say I listened to Drew's presentation, which was, as always, very good. Pointed out the important distinction between population level outcomes, the sort of global, how are people doing, and then the indicators which are meant to express our collective efforts to drive towards those population outcomes. Our report largely pointed out the shortcomings of many of the indicators. And while that was for the 2021, I believe, annual outcomes report, the same mistakes are still in that report, calling into question whether it has really any value at all in its current form. It doesn't mean it can't be improved. But one small example that I pointed out last time, but there's new and updated information. The percentage of the state covered in state-of-the-art telecommunications had been listed in the report that we had analyzed to be 96.2%, which we believe could not possibly reflect the reality most Vermonters face. After our report pointed out that this was an outdated measure, measuring 4:1 download and upload speeds, the report has just continued to present the graphic representation and now shows that 96.8% is covered. That's an example where data visualization and dashboards and what are often attempts to simplify complicated issues can sometimes conflate simplification with usefulness. And so we point out some opportunities to improve that report if it's going to continue to be produced. We also, I include in the memo the framework we provided for how one might best evaluate data that's presented to committees. This is something, frankly, that Ledge Council and JFO should probably do their own in-house training to develop and collaborate on their own analytic tools so that every time someone presents to a legislative committee a document that shows a bunch of data, your staff are evaluating it with the same filter as much as possible every time, not waiting for one person to just happen to ask an insightful, probing question. There is another document, the Programmatic and Performance Measure Budget Report. This is a report that the administration requires every department to submit a long list of performance measures to them for the purpose of budget development. The statute regarding that, we suggest taking a look at that and thinking about whether it could be cleaned up to better serve your purposes. But also it arrives in February or March each year, which is way too late for your staff to analyze it and for any use to you. So it may be a good tool internal to the executive branch, and that might be good on its own, but it is not serving the legislature because it comes too late in the process at present. On the issue of rulemaking, I was very happy to hear Jen show the new tracking for all the component aspects of legislation, including new rulemaking. So our first recommendation in the memo about rulemaking is now unnecessary, but we do provide a recommendation to Leg Council in addition to that for how staff might consistently work with committees when they are contemplating rulemaking so that the committees go in eyes wide open about how they can best ensure the ultimate result. And finally, what we call general oversight function, and Senator Brock, you had mentioned this in your first committee meeting, the need for what I think you described as something like a more targeted kind of ongoing oversight function. And that could be the government operations committees if they were tasked with the specific set of issues that I think were intended in that discussion. We actually agree that either the House and Senate rules, which dictate what committees do, or statutes that direct legislative activity could be strengthened to make a point of this. And I'll use again EB5 as the case. So EB5, one of the big contributors that has been identified as that problem is that ACCD was both promoting and regulating that program. The Government Accountability Committee had a very limited look at that issue back probably 5 years ago now. But there was no one to say, is there any other part of state government where those combined functions might be occurring? And if so, do we want to do something about it? And so it's effectively an important insight that then gets dropped because everyone moves on to the next thing. There was no dedicated place to make sure that line of inquiry was pursued to its fullest. So the memo goes into breezy conversational depth on each of those topics. I'll leave it there, other than to say one last piece, which is the resource issue, I think, is absolutely critical, whether it's fiscal notes, whether it's performance notes, whether it's the legistat concept. It can't be done for everything. So it's a matter of coming up with a mechanism by which some group is entrusted by the legislature to allocate those resources. Historically, the Joint Fiscal Committee has had a lot of say over what gets extra staff time and resources. That may be appropriate for certain fiscal issues. It probably is different when we're talking about broad government accountability themes. But that, to me, is the real nugget, is deciding who gets to decide, because that always becomes where things start to get hung up. So we're happy to help on any of the individual stuff. I know that your recommendations are likely to be more general rather than finely granulated, but we'll be awaiting your call.
Well, thank you, Tim. One question that I have, you looked at a lot of what was presented here today, what we've heard from New Mexico and elsewhere. And one of the issues when you talk about accountability more than anything else is independence. What are your thoughts about independence of the reviews, the data presented, and the results that come from it based on what you've heard that others are doing right now?
Well, I think I'll use the New Mexico example just because it's fresh. we believe our office that it's absolutely critical that it be independent, objective and nonpartisan review of
It was a leading
facts,
question.
of the facts, of the facts, right? The what to do with the facts is a political question. That's what you guys are all here for. But, and in fact, the near the end of, Charlie's presentation, he said something which I actually thought might be a little bit more problematic, which was, he said, in regards to the criminal justice issue, he talked about people were running for office, so everyone had these big ideas. And he said, we provided information that resulted in those ideas getting stopped in their tracks for presumably good policy reasons. And he said, but we've told our staff, we can't just be there to stop things. We have to come up with alternatives. That's a dangerous new territory to go into because that's starting to be almost like partisan staff. So the factual evaluation is something that the Joint Fiscal Office and Ledge Council, they can be counted on. They are the two most trusted entities probably that set foot in this building every day, other than the people in this room. And the question is, though, can they develop a framework to evaluate the facts consistently so that it doesn't matter if you're in health and welfare or you're in education, they're asking the same questions when presented with data from either the executive branch or from an interest group of some kind. And that is something that they certainly have the brain power to do. The question is, do they have the horsepower to do it? That's a resource issue.
Any other thoughts as to what the auditor's office relationship ought to be with the Government Accountability Committee, assuming one exists in that same format? For example, there are a number of states that a single committee receives overall all the reports, particularly the significant deficiencies and the like that are uncovered during audit, and also audit comments from performance audits to go to one place in addition to the committees of jurisdiction. So if there's a general oversight function, is that something that you think is useful or do you have concerns about it?
Well, I think having a dedicated place where our audits are reported is really important because right now statute requires us to send it to legislative leadership, the governor and the auditee and no one else. So everything we do beyond that is us trying to hustle and get attention of legislators who have precious little time. During the session, it's an open question whether that should be a policy committee, the one that has, a direct hand in the particular issue, or if it should go to some dedicated audit committee who's then going to just have to circle back with the policy committee anyways. So I think from my point of view, I would treat it not unlike the Joint Fiscal Committee, which is maybe a different approach off season as there is during the session. Whether it's a existing joint committee of some sort or a new one, I think we would be neutral on, but I think it's really important that there be someone who has taken responsibility of hearing these things. We do, for just as a reminder, I think I actually proposed this long ago, the state's single audit and the state's annual financial audit, those findings are reported to the Joint Fiscal Committee once a year. And that was in large part for the same reason that you're describing.
So something you just said struck me, that maybe there could be, and I'm just saying it out loud to make sure that I heard it right, that there could be a joint summer or whatever, summer and fall government accountability committee that did work with the auditor's office on those things that are similar maybe to ACCD, the example you gave us, which is, how do you get above it a little bit? We're not talking about the specific policy committees that have their work cut out for them around government accountability, but the bigger things so should we be looking into what happened with JP or not losing it? In other words, that there's still lessons to be learned. That's is that what?
Yeah, I mean, the Government Accountability Committee of the past did not do the things that I think people hoped it would do. And then the one project it seemed to get stuck on was what to do, if anything, about this outcomes report. And after years of discussing, little, if anything, really changed about it. So part of that was perhaps a task that legislators didn't prioritize for themselves. They came here to work on education, community development, whatever it is. They didn't come here to talk about indicators or things like that, right? The second is you had perhaps a task which is just not enjoyable for legislators to come together and do as a group. And as a result, things just kind of kept tumbling along. If the GAC, I don't want to say GAC anymore. If some new committee was reformed, the question is, could you make it more interesting so that people want to be on it too? I mean, that's the other key. When people are wanting to do the work because they're passionate about it, you'll get better work. When people feel they have to go because someone stuck them on the committee, that's a very different situation. So you heard about a process that draws in New Mexico twice the number of legislators that are actually on a committee. Whether that's the right model for Vermont, I don't know, but that tells us something, that people see that as a worthwhile way to determine whether things are going well. And they believe it's a useful place that they can change the trajectory of a particular program. So I don't know that a joint committee just to hear our periodic audit reports is the best limited use, but it certainly could be one of several core functions, which would include even perhaps the management, if you will, of these programmatic evaluations that staff would do if you head in that direction. So I just think on a practical level, you have to make it a enjoyable, rich joint committee structure if it's going to be worth its time.
Well, Tim, thank you very much for coming. We're obviously going to look at the documents that you've sent and delve into it further, and I'm sure we'll have further conversations going forward.
Great.
But again, thank you for coming and
Read it closely. All my jokes were in there. I didn't, want to keep them.
We can unmute.
and they're footnoted, I assume.
I actually deleted Doug's footnote.
Okay. We have a little bit of time left. And this is a committee discussion about the recommendations. And it's not that we're necessarily going to formulate the recommendations today. We have another meeting coming up, but I think we should be thinking about what it is we're going to recommend and where we're going to go, at least at this first stage. And we recognize that this isn't the end result. This is the recommendations to the committees of jurisdiction, in this case, likely the Government Operations Committee, about what our thoughts are about where to go and what things to include and perhaps some general guidance, at least in terms of our recommendations of how best to proceed. And also some of the results of what we've seen and heard. I'd like to today, if we can, just go around and just get, a 30-second or thereabouts of the high points of what your observations are and what you think should be included perhaps in some of our recommendations, not locking you in today to the final answer, because we're going to come back to you between now and the next meeting for more detail. So where should we start? Representative Kornhauser, you've always been first here today, so I'm going to point to you first.
Strong opinions about this project. So I think for me, the piece that I am thinking about as sort of a theme across this and why I think, as Tim said, previous iterations failed in certain ways, and that I'm using as sort of a guiding light in thinking about recommendations, is that we need to, in all cases, systematize rather than rely on inspiration. And the other piece of that is systematizing by instructing chairs to do something is the same as not systematizing. It needs to be systematized and resourced in a real way. And so that's like the big theme I'm going into this with. I think some combination of building out existing processes, like what Legislative Council is already doing with reports, but adding additional resources to it so it is much more efficient, and making sure that committees are accessing that in a meaningful way with staff time is really important. And then sort of similarly, I've been very obsessed with the New Mexico model since I first heard them at a conference. I was really excited to hear from them today. And so some iteration of that has been talked about at Joint Fiscal Office for many years. And I think is really quite possible. Of course, we do everything at a smaller scale than other states do. But I think that would be really important. And I could see it being combined with sort of an advisory committee similar to what Tim discussed. So everything, I guess, is my answer.
Okay.
Senator.
So this is very exciting. I'm really glad we're having this conversation. Overall, one of my takeaways, my probably largest overarching takeaway is I think state government needs to work and it needs to work well. And the more we do take around, trying to get around state government by making other agencies, like for example, I get a lot of folks saying we need county government in this state. I think that is not the way to go. I think we need to make the state government work for this state. I think we're small enough that the state government can work and can connect. Specifically, I think things we should look at are especially resources that are already available, accreditation. There's national accreditation for prisons, for example. That's something that we can look at. Standards would already be set. I think it's really important to find a way to get input from our customers. And I think our customers are the people who use our services, like the folks who use the Labor Department services, unemployed people, people who are getting workers' comp, unhoused folks. I think we need to get direct input, and we are starting to do more of that, but we need to do that in a systematic way and in a way that people can comment in a private way too, a confidential way. And those systems are out there. The corporate world uses those all the time. So I don't think that would be a heavy lift. Communications is really important because if we do something really good and people don't know about it, that's, we're not doing our job. So I think there has to be some communications aspect to what we recommend. One thing really specific is a statement of intent when you're proposing a bill, I think is critical. I was surprised that we didn't do that. The House does it. I kind of think the Senate should do it. I haven't seen how the House does it. But especially when you're looking at a bill after, 10 years after, 1 year after, and trying to determine why they made that legislation. I wanted to ask Jen, I'll ask her at another time, how we do scrivener's errors, because sometimes there's errors in the writing. And I don't know how we work those out, especially without intent. I don't even know if there's a process for it. So that's one thing that I'm going to find out, but that's a detailed question. I think it's really important to get the agencies recommendations and to get them in a space where they're not afraid to tell us the truth of what they would do. If they had all the resources in the world, what would they do? What would their priorities be? I think it's helpful to know that, even if we can't make them all come true. And just as an example of it was a process, but at the beginning of the session last year, there was a presentation of housing from ACCD in the big room, in the
pavilion.
Yes, but it's a big room downstairs. Yeah, and a lot of folks were there. They had really good information. It was an educational opportunity. If that has been expanded to have more legislative questions and comments, I mean, that kind of, I thought the setting was good and there was some excitement and it was good information. So building on things that work, I think should be part of what we do also. That's it for now.
Representative Levitt.
Thank you.
Sorry, hang on, I'm getting my video. Apparently it's not working. Try one more time. I really like what Rep. Kornheiser said. I feel like this isn't rocket science. But it's also really, really important. And it seems like I feel like we're not really connecting the dots. Like the dots are sort of floating off on their own, and Ledge Council is doing something and JFO is doing something, and some committees are doing things. I really took to heart what she said about that her committee assistant just always checks and puts these things on the agenda. That should be systemized. Yeah, systemized. That's how you say it. And I don't think, I feel like Senator Harrison, I love what you said, but I also feel like it's too big in some ways. And I'm afraid if we have such a large scope, we're going to actually lose focus, and that worries me. And I feel like that should be like phase 2. But I do like your point of we should go to end users. Like, how do people feel about the Department of Labor? My hunch is probably not so great. But is that our job to fix right now, or is that the Department of Labor's job to fix? So honestly, I'm still trying to figure out how to find out what all reports are still owed to the Ag Committee. And now that I learned more from Jen, I'm going to do that. But I feel like on a really basic level, we should know what should be coming to us and how it should be delivered and when it should have been delivered and who's missing a deadline. How has the money been spent? We have a grant in the ag thing that we did a bill. How is that $150,000? Has it all been spent? How many people applied? Was it effective? We don't know. We didn't write that in the bill, but that's really important information to have, because if that bill didn't work, why are we going to trot out another bill just like it if we haven't fixed how that first bill is or isn't working? So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Okay.
I guess we're going around the room. If I was going to pick up from that piece as far as did the bill work, did it not work, talking about how I got on the committee or how I the spot, sort of an upstream and downstream, or maybe a forward or backwards, if you look at it. And in terms of, yes, you get elected, you come in, there are also chairs that have a tremendous strength or whether they get picked. They've got things they've got to do and where they're going forward, some of which are not going to look backwards as to what happened. So I'm not sure where the idea of legislative oversight fits into the agenda of legislators that want to get more done. And we have 5 months of session and we want to get things done and through every single committee. So how can we systemize or mandate that chairs have to stop and go back to the things that happened before, and they have to look at what happened, and then we want to manage. I heard a lot of talk about how we manage the interaction with the executive branch when they come in to report, and how you deal with that information. So when you have an upstream or downstream or a forward and a backwards, can the current structure handle guidelines, system, and are those people that are elected to those spots really going to be directed into doing that? So yes, I totally believe the report system sounds really archaic. It sounds like we're paying lawyers to do clerical work. That sounds like they need some resources that probably we could get behind. But I'm looking at is legislative oversight important to the leadership of our legislature? And if it is, are we going to ask chairs to own some of that legislative oversight in their areas? But if we do, are we overstepping the kind of the freedom, the strength of why that person's a chair? But when are we going to look back and who is? And I had a pretty good idea that I thought that we needed to really look at the structure of how committees work and how they're operating, how they're managed, and what time frame of that 5 months you're looking back at the major issues that occurred. But I don't know that you can write a system of guidelines or instructions to tell chairs what to do. I don't know that. But I don't know in our system how other bigger resources or creating another department that everybody liked the New Mexico piece. I don't think that there's an appetite to increase a major resource. So I thought it had to be done within the committees, it feels like the committee structure should be different, but I'm not sure that certainly I can't mandate, how they would operate, but I want them to look back. I want them to look back where things went. And I heard all about the reports, which I think it really did nail what I expected about how difficult it is. But what if they're not filed? Even it comes up, they're not filed, or there didn't happen, or there's an issue. The committee's got to move on. I'm looking at you as a chair. I've not been a chair. I'm not, that's not likely to happen anytime soon. But you have an agenda that you ran on, or you've got to move forward. How much is the appetite for legislators to look back, but we know there's a need. We know that, how do you know that the things that we all committed to last session that we're saying are important are being done? And it seems like the policy committee is the only places to do that, but I don't. And that's what a lot of my notes are about, but I don't see how you mandate to a chair how to run their committee. So that's where I'm at. I think the structure of the committee, that it needs to look backwards to what has happened and then forwards to what, but I don't know how you can mandate to them how to run it. Lastly, I would say that I love all of the comments. There seems to be some general enthusiasm about some kind of review of any bill that says we've got to get better at intent. We've got to get better at how we're going to measure it. What is it going to look like? And I think people seem to be, pretty good around that idea that we've really got to kind of keep pushing back on what are we really trying to do with this particular bill. And I think there was some agreement around resources for this, the JFO and Ledge Council's clerical resources and modern technology. But I am really stuck on, I think that the chairs and the policy committee could do a lot of setting the tone if the leadership's on board of setting a tone of accountability, but I don't know that you can make them do it. I don't think that's even the right terms that I want to use. So.
Okay. Senator Renner.
I appreciate all the comments and suggestions thus far. I'm reminded that there was a woman from Wales who spoke after our last committee meeting across the hall, and she, I believe, was an independent actor within the Welsh government for a number of years and asked some really hard questions. And I think it was really important to have someone like that really outside the system whose job is just to kind of keep after the committees and keep after the agencies and departments, and keep them honest. I mean, there's confirmation bias, there's groupthink, there's all kinds of things that we fall prey to as human beings, as well-intentioned as we are. And her job was kind of, as I heard it, to be a little bit adversarial and just remind people of the values that they had said were important to them. And she didn't have a political position. And it was really important because she alone was not falling prey to, well, I gotta get elected in a month or something, or in 12 months. And so I think that's a critical piece as well. And I would also suggest maybe we start small. Maybe we just, for the first year, however we form ourselves or reform, maybe we just follow up on things the auditor's office has come up with over the past 5 years. Maybe we just start and prove our value with a limited universe of things that we go after and try to clean up, and then move on from there. And then we've proven our worth, and the chairs go, yeah, they did some good work here. Maybe we should include more something else on other bill that pass review. Thanks.
Excellent, thanks. I feel a little bit like I'm going, you know that game, I'm going on a picnic and I'm going to bring, and you have to remember what everyone said so you can make a quick comment and then add to it. And so I'm going to try and do that a little bit. But I think, Emily, thank you. I love systemize and resourced. That is, I've been thinking structural, that word, but I like systemize much better. Mm-hmm. I think that we are really looking to make broad recommendations. And Matt, what you said about, I'm worried we can't tell the chairs what to do. Remember that we're making broad recommendations. We're not going to set policy here and at this time. That's really up to the government operations committees as Act 53 states, that we will be making broad recommendations. There are some specific things that Wendy brought up that I think are really interesting to think about, but we have to be careful about not going down a rabbit hole, but we could put those together into sort of an addendum of these are some of the areas that we think are, important for the government operations committees to think about when they think broadly. So I agree to some extent on the, I don't want to tell committee chairs what to do, but I do feel as if there is a place for a recommendation around looking back in order to inform the future. And I feel that just in my own committee, we're getting ready to do e-cigarettes again. There are some real issues around flavored tobacco and flavored, all those things, whether or not you agree or disagree. I was the reporter of the bill 4 years ago that raised the age from 18 to 21 that said you can't sell e-cigarettes on the internet because kids were getting them that way, right? And also raise the tax rate up to what tobacco. So my big point to my chair was we cannot move forward on the bill that the Senate has sent us until we look back at what's happening over there. Is it working? Is the Attorney General fined anyone for sending it on the internet? Has the there's just so many questions I have. I've started to list them because I've gone back and looked at my last bill, and my chair is very open to that. She absolutely agrees. Okay, that's the first part. Let's go back and look at that and see, is this the right solution for that problem, right? Before we move forward. And I think that's what you're saying, Matt. And I agree. I think that we don't do enough of that. But I also think that the systemized piece is big, is that there is so much low, what is it called?
Hanging fruit.
Hanging fruit on that area, like all the stuff that Jen told us. It's not fair, really, that Ledge Council comes in here and there's hundreds of new bills and they're expected to go in and talk to committees about them and then follow up on the really important ones and boom, boom, boom. They're off and running. And yet then they spend their entire summer, 70 to 100. Whoa. It just hit me that that's a lot to follow, right? So how can we systemize a process where our committee assistants help us to look through that? And also that's the same with our auditor. I think that we should hear him or her out on what they're finding, right? Even if it's just a cursory conversation in our committees, we should be having that conversation. We should be putting some % of our committee policy time into accountability. And if you don't want to look back at anything because maybe you don't really have something to look back at because no data was collected in order to do that, then how do we do a better job going forward? So doing some education around the next time we let a bill go out of this committee, we're going to make sure that we know who's responsible for measuring what and make sure that we put the funds in there to make sure that that whoever is responsible has the money to actually do it. So there's a lot of stuff out there that I've been listening all day, and I want to just apologize to the committee too. I mean, I put the agenda together and it was tight and a lot of information between the last 2 times, and we haven't had time to do this, and this needs to be what we do next time. And also LCAR, I really think we should hear from LCAR because they're doing a piece of it too, to understand what are they doing. And so, sorry.
Right. Well, I guess I'll sum up. I agree with everybody. We touch on a lot of things that are really, really important. I think that among the things, though, that as we look at what we do going forward, we may have a vision about where we're going to go, but I think we've got to take those baby steps and do this a step at a time, and also measure ourselves how well what we've done is working as we go, and look backward as well as forward. I think whatever we come up with has to be simple. It has to be clear. It has to be independent. It has to be objective. It's got to be fact-based. That said, we have 2 different problems from 2 different ends. One is the overall objectives as a report, and then the individual stuff of the bills that we deal with, and connecting the 2 of them is not nearly as easy as it may sound. And we're not necessarily, I think, at least going forward, going to be saying there's got to be a piece about accountability in every bill that we do, because there's some bills that really don't warrant it and don't necessarily warrant the time, at least at this stage. One of the things that does concern me is objectivity and also data quality. We talked, for example, about the folks who are providing the information that we have that goes into the data. And I don't want to pick on Building Bright Futures, but Building Bright Futures is an advocate group. And when we talk about the separation between organizations that are promoting something and organizations that are providing oversight to it, there to be immediately is the question, is the data we're getting good? Despite the intent may be absolutely fine, but is it good? It's just the same thing that we talked about when we talked about the issue about data regarding connectivity, in which you've got a report, an outcomes report saying you got 96% connected, and all you have to do is drive down the highway, and you know that isn't true. Where's the data coming from? And is it accurate that even though people are not necessarily giving you bad data, it's the independence of what you're getting in terms of an oversight function that's absolutely critical. I lean more towards if we add resources, looking at JFO and Ledge Council and the auditor's office that I do anybody else, because hopefully they don't have a dog in the fight. And we can view the information that they give us in terms of data objectively. In a way, Ledge Council and JFO are probably the good ones to do it, quote unquote, or to collect it and evaluate it. And then the auditor's office have that third level oversight as to whether or not we've got good information and do that selectively. If we talk about the additional resources, I think one of the things we should think about is what's the return on investment? Because that's, if we're going to measure anything, that's the investment. If we throw a ton of money at providing a better process for accountability, is it working? And is there a return on investment of the money that we spent? Or are we just putting a ton of money into bureaucracy and not really accomplishing a whole lot?
You want accountability for accountability?
I do.
I love that.
I do.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
Because otherwise we may be wasting a lot of time. There are some words that have been mentioned around, though, that I think are particularly important today. And starting with you, Emily, you mentioned systematized and resource. I think those are critically important. I think the notion of accreditation in terms of the credentials of the origin of the data that we get is an important word. Communication is critical. You know, we have a lot of data that we're collecting, and we talked about some of the data that Jen talked about today. It's not communicated. And, you know, we have a great deal of information. People, the public, how does the public know about all of these reports? Because they don't have the spreadsheets and so on. And so we have to have the ability to communicate what's available to the public that, as well as to us to be able to use. The clear statement of intent in legislation is, I think, critically important, because how do you measure whether or not you've achieved it? But going to the next step in particular bills that we may think about, not necessarily in every bill to start with, but there's certain critical bills. What is the intent of this bill? And then somewhere in there, what's the measurement mechanism and timetable for measurement as part of the bill? So that somebody is forced legislatively to go back and look at it after the fact. And again, starting early, it's not that we do it with every bill, but there are certain things in which, and perhaps key bills, and we can come up with some kind of definition or criteria around what are the bills that we do that. But I think that's going to be important for us to at least to recommend. So I think those are kind of the high level things that at least that have struck me about the discussion here today.
I just want to correct one thing. Building Bright Futures is not an advocacy group.
I know that.
But you just said that.
I know that it is not an advocacy group, but you tell me anybody who's on that group or on its advisory committee right now who believes we should spend less money on childcare.
Richie.
Yeah, there's a lot, and there's a big spend on it that I would say. I don't think that's, I want to be really clear for the public too, that is not what they are.
And I worked there, and I actually left the job there in order to run for office because I couldn't work there and be in office at the same time.
Okay.
Yeah, I do. It's very important. Okay, so where do we go?
So where do we go from here? Well, we obviously have homework to do. We have documents that were presented to us today that were presented. We didn't get into the detail. We didn't see the detail of the auditor's document. There's a lot of fine print in what we got from New Mexico that I think we should all read and digest and think about. We probably ought to go to New Mexico and spend a couple of days.
Maybe collect, I'm thinking that if folks want to send recommendations to, they can send that, you can send them to me and I'll
Yep.
put them all on one document so that
That'd be
when
important.
we come in next time, we'll all have a copy of it. And it doesn't matter how crazy it is. I'm not even going to put anyone's names next to it. I think we just put out there what we're thinking in our head and have a list of recommendations. Maybe at the beginning of the meeting, we hear from Elkhart. Should we hear from Joint Fiscal? What are people's thoughts?
Yeah, I think joint fiscal is interested
Yeah, I
in
think
coming in
Catherine
to
would-
talk
yeah.
about
What
Yeah.
they
like what,
I
how,
spoke-
what they've heard about this over the years. Yeah.
Okay, so let's do that. So those two things. And then we just leave a bunch of time for us to start to scratch our heads and look
Yeah.
at these recommendations and
Yeah,
figure
the
out
other
things
thing, though,
together.
that we also have to think about in terms of our charge is the other pieces
Yes, and I have.
on this list that we are tasked with doing that we may give a sentence or two to, but we do need to
And
address.
that's an excellent point. And I talked to, and I forgot about that. I talked to NCSL.
Yep.
And they're going to bring us, what are other states doing around and grouping those
Yep.
as sort of equity questions?
Yep.
And bringing that in, and maybe we can take that document and just put it as an addendum to our recommendations around number one and say, these are places that we believe the government operations committees could do some review and hear testimony on in order to drill down on the equity question. So that would also happen at the next meeting, which I believe is November 3rd. Am I right?
How many meetings do we have?
Oh, that's another
Okay.
good question. I talked to the speaker and I don't know if you talked to the Senate.
I did not talk to Bill Bell.
Well, so we can do that, but I talked to the speaker and she thought we should start with one extra meeting. And then if we were really in need of it, we could add another one, but that she knows what happens as well as we all do around the holidays and just all the work. You can see already what happened to October. We were all filled with meetings.
And if we go past, say, mid-November, I think you would have some trouble drafting a final report in time.
Yeah, so we need to really, so that means the next meeting, we get these few other things done. And we really work on some recommendations so that Tim can help us begin to put it together in a report. And then the next meeting would be more of a looking at a report or a list or however, whatever we want to call it, a letter or a report, but we'll have our recommendations. That's my thought.
Any other thoughts that anybody has today that will help guide us towards the next steps?
The finish line.
Thank you.
On that note, everybody, thank you very, very much for today.
Thanks,
Really appreciate
everybody.
it.
Good to see everybody.
We accomplished something.
Charlene, are you ending the meeting or should one of us press a button?
She's going to take us off.
Okay.
Charlene, if that's okay.
I will end the meeting for all.